Hello, everybody. Welcome to this lecture on Demeter, Persephone, and the Eleusinian Mysteries. So, who is the goddess Demeter, the Earth Mother, goddess of grain and of agriculture, the Roman Ceres, and the goddess of the mysteries? Her name derives from Ge and Meter, which means Earth Mother, and she is often called Dio, usually represented as a mature woman wearing a crown and bearing sheaves of wheat or a cornucopia, the horn of plenty, and a torch. Demeter is the sister of Hera, Hestia, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, and she is the second-born of the Olympian goddesses after Hestia. She is present in many myths, but most famous for her response to the abduction of her daughter, Persephone, as retold in Apollodorus, Diodorus Siculus, and above all, the Homeric hymn to Demeter. There's also much tantalizing evidence that Orpheus was the first to tell this myth and found her sanctuary. We'll be looking into the Orphic connections to Demeter and mystery cult next week. Her cult sanctuary is at Eleusis and is second to none in importance, at times rivaling even Apollo's sanctuary at Delphi or Zeus's at Olympia. She is often identified with Rhea, Cybele, or even Isis, and can rightly be described as the greatest matriarch of antiquity in her dominant and universal Eleusinian mysteries. She is Zeus's fourth wife, after Metis, Themis, and Eurynome in Hesiod, and she bears to Zeus Persephone, Cora, or the Maiden, who becomes the queen of Hades. It is in Hesiod's Theogony that we find our earliest reference to Zeus's union with Demeter and the rape of Persephone by Aidoneus, or Hades. After Zeus slept with Demeter, who nurtures many, she bore white-armed Persephone, whom Aidoneus snatched away from her mother with the consent of wise Zeus. Clearly not with her own consent here, or Demeter's. In other myth, Demeter has connections to Poseidon, also a second-born Olympian god, who mated with Demeter in the form of a stallion. Poseidon pursued her while she was searching for her daughter, and her ruse of changing into a mare to escape him was to no avail. Awfully, as covered in previous lectures, Poseidon's rape of Demeter is sometimes said to have occurred during the very same period of her wandering in grief over the loss by rape of her daughter Persephone. If we are to take that as the standard version of the tale, we could probably say that Demeter is simply the most abused of the Greek goddesses, and perhaps in part for that reason one of the most powerful. Poseidon's and Demeter's child was Despoina of the Arcadian mysteries. Demeter also has arcane, mysterious connections to the god Prometheus. As we heard earlier in the lecture on Prometheus, the dispute of gods and mortals over sacrifice and fire happened at Mekone, the place of the poppies, associated with the Ciconian cult of Demeter and Persephone. And in Samothracian mystery cult, which we'll cover more in week 14, it is sometimes said that Demeter brought her mysteries first to Prometheus. At the end of the Theogony, we hear of her first coupling with a mortal man, radiant Demeter, a goddess, and Iason, a hero, coupled with passion on a field plowed 3 times in the rich soil of Crete, their child, noble Plutus. This myth has often been compared to the coupling of Aphrodite and Anchises, and the child Plutus which results, whose name means wealth, here in Hesiod is a separate god from Hades, though the identification of Pluto and Hades is also probably quite ancient. Demeter has many offsprings in myth, including Arion, an immortal horse, after being raped by Poseidon in the form of a horse, and alongside Despoina, and with Iason either Plutos or Corybas, the leader of the Corybantes, and Philomelos, the inventor of the wagon and of the plowshare. All of her children seem to have agricultural connections, and we can say that Demeter is more than any other Olympian goddess, a goddess of nature. Another famous myth of Demeter involves Tantalus, one of the worst of the criminals in Tartarus, because he fed his son Pelops to the Olympians during the age of conviviality of gods and humans, believing he could trick them and show they were not really so powerful or omniscient. It is interesting that only Demeter, goddess of nature and agriculture, wrapped in thought, dazed and distracted as she had been over the disappearance of her daughter Cora, picked up a piece of meat and ate it. It was Pelops's shoulder blade, and when they reconstituted Pelops, they had to replace it with a shoulder of ivory. In other versions of this myth, Demeter was distracted because the feast took place during the winter months, when Persephone was away in Hades. The notion of the distraction and absent-mindedness of the goddess Demeter appears in the Pelops myth and also in the hymn to Demeter, as we'll see, both when Baubo distracts Demeter and evokes her smile, and when Persephone is distracted, both in the Meadow of Flowers and when she consumes the pomegranate seeds. There are different versions of all her myths, but we'll start here with the Homeric hymn to Demeter. As to her daughter Persephone, or Cora, she is the queen of the underworld and the wife of Hades. A goddess of spring growth, of salvation or curse in the afterlife, and she has two names, Cora, meaning maiden, and Persephone, connected to Perses, Persis, or Persaios, i.e. the father of Hecate. Her name may mean destructive slayer, from Perso and Phonos, and she is also named Pharaphassa in other Greek dialects, and Proserpina by the Romans. She is often depicted alongside both her mother Demeter and Hecate, sometimes her maidservant, and usually as a perpetual maiden. In ancient depictions, she holds sheaves of grain and a flaming torch, much like her mother, and is often shown alongside Triptolemos, the mortal teacher of agriculture, but usually enthroned alongside her husband Hades. It is in modern depictions that she's most shown holding the pomegranate fruit. In one of the most disturbing Orphic myths of all, Persephone herself was born when Zeus mated with Demeter in the form of entwined serpents, which is suggestive of the chthonic aspects of all three gods. Most famous is her myth of marriage by abduction and rape to Hades, but she has many subsequent roles in myth as the queen of the underworld. In Hyginus, she is identified with Kura, or Care, as the creator of humanity from clay in a riverbed. And in Orphism, she is the mother of Zagreus, Dionysus, Melanoe, and the Erinyes, all by Zeus, which would of course make her the product of a double incest. She is the lover of Adonis alongside Aphrodite, and the two compete for his affection, and she punishes the nymph Minthe for her affair with Hades, turning her into the Mint. While she has many favorites among the heroes or eminent mortals such as Sisyphus, Orpheus, Alcestis, and Heracles, she also brutally punishes those she disapproves of, also Alcestis and Perithous. The myths of her relationships to special mortals revolve around the motif of her favor and disfavor, as in the Orphic Gold Leaves, more on them next week, and in Apuleius' tale, she assists Psyche, but punishes many nymphs and mortal females in other myth. Scholars believe the Homeric hymn to Demeter was composed sometime between 750 and 600 BCE by an unknown author, although many suggest Orpheus. The Telesterion, or Hall of Rites, is not mentioned in the hymn, and was built only when Athens took control of Eleusis close to the end of the 7th century BCE. Since Athens is also not mentioned in the hymn, although nearby, Athanasicus favors a dating during the first half of the 7th century, that is, before the Athenian invasion. This hymn is quite simply the foundational text for what's known as the Eleusinian Mysteries, which may go back to before 1900 BCE, according to the archaeological analysis by George E. Mylonas in his 1961 book. According to myth, the first king of Eleusis was Eumolpus, contemporary of King Erechtheus in Athens, see the Poseidon lecture, and according to the usual dating of these mythical founders, worship of Demeter at Eleusis must go back at least as far as 1500 to 1300 BCE. Aristotle tells us that the rites of Demeter at Eleusis were founded around 1300 BCE. This hymn, perhaps the most poetically beautiful of the Homeric hymns, tells the tale of Persephone's abduction by Hades, Demeter's mournful response, her eventual reunion, and the founding of her mysteries at Eleusis. And we can note here that Homer's Iliad and Odyssey completely ignore this tale, likely because of its chthonic character and strong unpatriarchal storyline, as well as Bacchic connections. Additional treatments of the same theme can be found in Euripides' Helena, Callimachus' hymn, as well as Ovid's Fasti and Metamorphosis. Most importantly for our understanding of this hymn, it reveals Demeter to be the only Olympian goddess to have staged a successful rebellion against the administrative decisions of Zeus. Here, the Neolithic goddess of grain, harvest, and matriarchy did sustain some of her previous dominance in the ancient Greek world. The myth itself, told in the Homeric hymn, can be divided into these 9 parts: Persephone's abduction, Hecate and Helios' witnessing, Demeter's grief, anger, and retaliation, Demeter's coming to Eleusis in the form of an old woman, her arrival at the Maiden's Well, her meeting with the daughters of Queen Matanera and then Matanera herself and Iambe, the breaking of her fast, her nursing of Demophon until she's discovered, her brokering of a deal with the Olympians, and Hades giving to Persephone the pomegranate to eat before her return, Demeter's ecstatic reunion with Persephone, and the negotiation of her long-term release, as well as Demeter finally restoring fertility and establishing her mysteries. The hymn begins in the meadow of Persephone's play. I begin to sing of the lovely-haired Demeter, the goddess august, of her and her slender-ankled daughter, whom Zeus, far-seeing and loud-thundering, gave to Aidoneus to abduct. Away from her mother of the golden sword and the splendid fruit, she played with the full-bosomed daughters of Oceanus, gathering flowers, roses, crocuses, and beautiful violets. Over a soft meadow, irises too and hyacinths she picked, and narcissus, which Gaia, pleasing the all-receiver, made blossom there by the will of Zeus for a girl with a flower's beauty. A lure it was, wondrous and radiant, and a marvel to be seen by the immortal gods and mortal men. 100 stems of sweet-smelling blossoms grew from its roots. Note here that Gaia is imagined by the poet as being in cahoots with the will of Zeus, and herself creating the snare, the narcissus flower, through which Persephone would be abducted. Athanasicus notes that the gathering of flowers at the start of the hymn is not mere poetic embellishment, but must correspond to the ritualistic aspect of the worship of Demeter and Persephone as goddesses of vegetation. Survivals of flower-gathering festivals can still be found in most rural communities of Greece. Note how Gaia herself is complicit with the plan of Zeus in sending up the beautiful narcissus flower, which is particularly associated with great goddesses and with death. When Demeter and Persephone are eventually reunited, we hear more about the goddesses who are playing with Persephone, a list of very beautiful names: Leucippe, Phino, Electra, Ianthe, Melite, Rhodia, Callirrhoe, Melobosus, Tuque, or Caroe, beautiful as a flower, Chrysis, Ionera, Acaste, Admete, Rhodope, Pluto, lovely Calypso, Styx and Urania, and charming Galaxora, and quite troublingly, Pallas, the battle-rouser, and Artemis, delighting in arrows. Not only does Gaia seem to be in cahoots with Zeus here, but Pallas Athena and Artemis, two protectors of virginity, are present. Since they fail to protect Persephone, can we not assume they are also accomplices? And lastly, we should note that all this takes place in the mythical Nusian fields, in the far west near Oceanus, the very place in which the infant Dionysus was raised by the nymphs of Nusia, perhaps indicating the hymn's awareness of the close connections of Persephone and Dionysus. The hymn goes on, Persephone was dazzled and reached out with both hands at once to take the pretty bauble. Earth with its wide roads gaped, and then over the Nusian field the Lord, all-receiver, the many-named son of Cronos, sprang out upon her with his immortal horses. Against her will he seized her, and on his golden chariot carried her away as she wailed. And she raised a shrill cry, calling upon Father Cronades, the highest and the best. What a heartbreaking abduction scene. But none of the immortals or of mortal men heard her voice, not even the olive trees bearing splendid fruit. Only the gentle-tempered daughter of Perseus, Hecate of the shining headband, heard from her cave, and Lord Helios, the splendid son of Hyperion, heard the maiden calling Father Cronades. He sat apart from the gods, away from the temple of prayers, accepting beautiful sacrifices from mortal men. And so, by Zeus's counsel, his brother, the All-Receiver, the ruler of many, Cronus' son of many names, Aidoneus, was carrying her away with his immortal horses against her will. Note that unlike in many other rape scenes in Greek mythology, the author of this hymn repeatedly stresses that this is an abduction, and even seems to take Persephone's perspective in underlining the traumatic moral wrongness of this scene. The abduction of Persephone is quite simply the most famous Greek rape myth of all time. A myth in which marriage, gamos, means, according to the etymology of the word, to seize, but this hasn't stopped the myth from being frequently depicted very romantically and beautifully. And contemporary neo-pagan New Age communities continue to reenact this scene, as in this hilarious image of what I can only assume is a pot grower. At what, given that barn in the background, is Persephone most likely being a trimagrant in his crow scene. Bernini is often held up as a model of Baroque art, and an extremely sensual sculptor. He certainly doesn't hold back from depicting the erotic, even when terrifying elements of this scene. Here, Persephone twists and cries out as she vainly attempts to escape the clutches of the god. And seen from the right, the statue is even more dramatic, with Hades sinking his fingers into her thigh, beneath which is the open jaw of Cerberus, ready to bite. Is Bernini's statue meant to heighten our pity and horror at the violence and cruelty of Hades? Or is it, like so much of Western mythology, designed to celebrate and exalt this myth? So how should we understand the marriage or hierogamy of Persephone and Hades? Well, as discussed in the lecture on Hera, the marriage of Hades and Persephone is the second most important hieros gamos, and in many ways also a model for mortal human marriage. But this is kind of weird, and we need to spend a moment wrapping our heads around it. For in the case of the hierogamy of Zeus and Hera, we can see that despite the marital issues, Zeus's rampant infidelity, and Hera's ongoing wrath, nevertheless, this marriage can be a model for the wedding bond and the marriage institution. Why? Because its most enduring feature is permanence and stability. How on earth, then, did the marriage by abduction, or rape, also come to signify one of the ideal hierogamies which human beings imitate? And here we can recall first that marriage was primarily a bond between men involving the exchange of daughters, gifts, and alliances of households, usually for the purpose of economic or political prosperity. Mothers and women of the family did not need to be consulted, and consent from the bride was desirable but not necessary. The abduction of Persephone by Hades is an extreme, to be sure, but does reflect normal Greek marriage practices, which are generally an arrangement above all between the father and the groom. Second, even the fact that Persephone is being married to her uncle, the incest motif, is not abnormal or even seen as incest by the ancient Greeks. Marriage was patrifocal and inheritance was patrilineal. And so a father without sons, not that this is Zeus's case, might often arrange the marriage of his daughter to the nearest male relative, who was most often the uncle. And such wives acquired a special legal status, involving ownership of the family estates and properties. The Greek term epikleros is a daughter whose lineage is heir to her father's. Persephone is certainly not an epikleros in being the only child of Zeus, but she is in the myth an epikleros in being the only child of the union of Zeus and Demeter. Next, as patrifocal, the bride would invariably move into the house of the husband's family. If the husband lived in a nearby neighborhood, the bride might see her mother's family fairly often. But if further away, marriage often became a complete separation from the mother and the acquiring of a completely new familial identity. Emotionally, a distant daughter has effectively disappeared and is lost, even dead, to her maternal family. And here Persephone is the archetypal example of a wife completely separated from the world of the mother, since Olympian gods don't generally visit Hades. And so, with just this small overview of the sociology of Greek marriage, we can understand why the marriage of Persephone and Hades forms a model for Greek marriage and also for mother-daughter separation. Demeter's grief in the marriage by abduction of her daughter would have been shared by many Greek mothers. The hymn goes on, so while Persephone looked upon the earth and the starry sky and the swift-flowing sea teeming with fish and the rays of the sun, she still hoped to see her loving mother and the races of the gods immortal. Hope charmed her mind despite her grief. The peaks of the mountain and the depths of the sea resounded with her immortal voice, and her mighty mother heard her. And at this we get the onset of Demeter's grief. A sharp pain gripped Demeter's heart, and she tore the headband round her divine hair with her own hands. From both of her shoulders she cast down her dark veil and rushed like a bird over the nourishing land and the sea, searching, but none of the gods or mortal men wanted to tell her the truth, and none of the birds of omen came to her as a truthful messenger. For 9 days then all over the earth mighty Dio roamed with bright torches in her hands, and her sorrow never tasted ambrosia or nectar sweet to drink, and never bathed her skin. The number of days of Demeter's search may then be repeated in the number of days of fasting prior to the initiations at Eleusis, as we'll see. And note also how here Demeter holds a torch in both hands in her search. But when the 10th light-bringing dawn came to her, Hecate, carrying a light in her hand, met her, and with loud voice spoke to her and told her the news. Mighty Demeter, bringer of seasons and splendid gifts, which of the heavenly gods or of mortal men seized Persephone and pierced with sorrow your dear heart? For I heard a voice, but did not see with my eyes who it was. I am quickly telling you the whole truth. Thus Hecate spoke, And to her the daughter of lovely-haired Rhea answered not a word, but with her she sped away swiftly, holding the bright torches in her hand. A question we can ask here is whether, since Demeter hears the testimony of Hecate first, that is, before going to Helios, does this suggest that Hecate is already early identified as a moon goddess? Demeter and Hecate then come to Helios, the watcher of men, and stood near his horses, and the illustrious goddess made a plea. Helios, do have some respect for me as a goddess. If I ever cheered your heart and soul by word or deed, to the barren ether I heard the shrieking voice of my daughter famous for her beauty, a sweet flower at birth, as if she were being overcome by force, but I saw nothing. And since you do gaze upon the whole earth and the sea, and cast your rays through the bright ether, tell me truly if you have seen anywhere what god or even mortal man in my absence seized by force my dear child and went away. Thus she spoke, and Hyperionides, an epithet of Helios meaning son of Hyperion, gave her an answer. Lady Demeter, daughter of lovely-haired Rhea, you shall know, for I greatly reverence and pity you. In your grief for your slender-ankled child, no other immortal is to be blamed, save cloud-gathering Zeus, who gave her to Hades, his own brother, to become his buxom bride. He seized her and with his horses carried her crying loud to the misty darkness. But goddess, stop your great wailing. You mustn't give yourself to grief so great and fruitless. Not an unseemly bridegroom among immortals is Aidoneus, lord of many. Your brother from the same seed. To his share fell honor when in the beginning a triple division was made, and he dwells among those over whom his lot made him lord. Helios in Greek myth always being the god that sees all, it does make sense that he witnesses Persephone's abduction, although we moderns might say the god is not all-knowing here, in his readiness to simply justify, mitigate, or even approve of these events. Certainly the god here is no true ally of Demeter, and appears to wholly accept the will of Zeus and to wish to stay out of it, again strengthening Demeter's chthonic connections, despite the fact that her gift of agriculture depends on the sun's rays. With these words he called upon his horses, and at his command speedily, like long-winged birds, they drew the swift chariot, as a pain more awful and savage reached Demeter's soul. Thanks for the help there, Helios, I guess. Afterwards, angered with Cronion, lord of the black clouds, she withdrew from the assembly of the gods and from lofty Olympus, and went through the cities of men and the wealth of their labors, tearing at her fair form for a long time. Demeter tearing at her fair form or robe is a gesture that would normally be performed in grieving the death of a loved one. Although she is only married to Hades, Demeter is effectively mourning the death of Persephone. Persephone is lost to the land of the dead and has been married to the god of the dead. The hierogamy of Persephone to Hades is the marriage to death, but also, as we'll see through the political machinations of Demeter, to life's resurrection and return. No woman looking at her knew who she was before she reached the house of prudent Helios, who then was lord of Eleusis, a town rich in sacrifices. Grieving in her dear heart, she sat near the road at the Parthenion, not to be confused here with the Parthenon in Athens, the well from which the citizens drew water, in the shade of a bushy olive tree which grew above it. She looked like an old woman born a long time ago and barred from childbearing and the gifts of wreath-loving Aphrodite, even as are nurses for the children of law-tending kings and the keepers of the storerooms in their bustling mansions. Grieving in her heart, she sat near the road at the Parthenion, the well from which the citizens drew water, in the shade of a bushy olive tree which grew above it. She looked like an old woman born a long time ago and barred from childbearing and the gifts of wreath-loving Aphrodite, even as are the nurses for the children of law-tending kings and the keepers of the storerooms in their bustling mansions. Moving very much to the stages of grief, Demeter's shock, horror, denial, and anger here turns into withdrawal and melancholy. For the immortal goddess of nature and the grain, the withdrawal from the company of the Olympians is a literal disguising of herself as a mortal, although we can't say it's a literal transformation into a mortal, since she still remains a goddess. Indeed, gods wearing disguises among mortals is a common motif in Greek myth, and hence all their hospitality codes surrounding the unknown guest. It is also highly significant that Greek goddesses never appear as crones in myth except here. Demeter, whose depiction is almost uniformly that of a mature woman in the fullness of life, in her grief and withdrawal disguises herself as an older maidservant and acquires the name Doso, which still bespeaks her nature from dosis, which means giving. Her pseudonym here still suggestive of her true nature. Near the Parthenion and at the Maiden's Well, the daughters of Kelios saw her as they were coming to fetch easily drawn water in copper vessels to their father's dear halls, 4 of them in their maidenly bloom like goddesses, and now more beautiful names, Callidike, Cleisydike, and Demo the lovely, and Callithoe, who was the eldest of all. They did not know who she was, for it is hard for mortals to see divinity. Standing near, they addressed her with winged words. "Old woman, whence and from what older generation do you come? Why have you wandered away from the city and not approached a house? There in the shadowy halls live women of your age, and even younger ones, who will treat you kindly in both word and deed." It is now that Demeter tells her that her name is Doso, and that she is of noble birth, but was abducted by pirates on Crete, and how she escaped during the mealtime to avoid being sold into slavery. Here Demeter becoming the goddess of refugees, of the oppressed and of all abducted women in their nobility of soul. Doso next offers her services to the house of Kelios, quote, "I could hold a newborn child in my arm and care for him well, make my master's bed in the recess of his well-built chambers, and teach the women their tasks." A fallen goddess here seeking a surrogate life as a servant, precisely unable to be anything other than her beneficent and giving nature. The daughters are deeply impressed with Doso and tell her all about the honorable and wise men who live in the city of Eleusis, and each family name here mentioned will become an important part of the Eleusinian mysteries, of Eleusinian traditions and their lineages. The daughters also aver that any household would employ Doso, since she looks like a goddess, here meaning of very noble birth, and they beg her to come to their mother's house, Metaneira, who has just had a son after 4 daughters. A growing son is being reared in the well-built mansion, born late in her life, much wished for and welcome. After being promised a large wage and escorted by the water-bearing maidens who had just leapt like deers and heifers in the season of spring, brooding Demeter is remet and brought to the threshold of the house. But as soon as the goddess stepped on the threshold, she touched the roof of it with her head and filled the doorway with divine radiance. Awe, reverence, and pale fear seized the mother Metaneira, and she yielded her seat to the goddess and asked her to sit, imploring her with her hands. The scene here of Demeter's head touching the roof is much like in the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, when Aphrodite's revelation to Anchises does the same. For superhuman stature is assigned to the gods in Greek religion, and radiance is a token of their divine presence. Note as well the tragic but also comic inversions which take place here. Doso, according to her story, is an older noble woman very much down on her luck. Having escaped from the pirates, her situation is still dire. She is without home and employment. And under normal circumstances, this would very much be the scene of her job interview. However, the extreme divine radiance is irrepressible, precisely at the threshold of the house. Instead of being a suppliant to her prospective employer, it is Metaneira, the mother of the house, who immediately supplicates the old and forlorn woman. Just imagine if you were in a similar situation. It is Metaneira who offers her the chair on which to sit, but Demeter, the bringer of seasons and splendid gifts, did not want to sit on the lustrous seat. She kept silent and cast her beautiful eyes, until Iambe, knowing her duties, placed in front of her a well-fitted seat, and over it she threw a white fleece. Just imagine yourself in a similarly dire situation. At this point, the job interview would most likely be completely thrown. Your prospective employer likely believing you had no idea of your place and were mentally unstable, breaking down into tears in a fit of deep depression at the very threshold of the house. The Greeks, thankfully, were much more understanding and hospitable than us. Iambe and Metaneira both doing everything they can to welcome and ameliorate the sorrow of the foreigner, of the foreign refugee. This is Greek hospitality at its finest. And on the more modest seat with the white fleece, Demeter sat, and with her hand she held in front of her a veil, doing nothing and speaking to nobody, and without laughing or tasting food and drink, she sat pining with longing for her deep-girded daughter, until Iambe, knowing her duties, with her jokes and many jests, induced the pure and mighty one to smile and laugh and have a gracious temper. At later times, too, Iambe was able to please her moods. This scene is interesting for a lot of reasons. Earlier in the hymn, the three goddesses Demeter, Persephone, and Hecate are all separate at the beginning. Persephone is abducted and Demeter and Hecate team up. Here Demeter is at her wit's end, and Metaneira and Iambe, her maidservant, seem almost to play Demeter and Hecate for her. In the Orphic version, Iambe is called Baubo, and in this version she induces the goddess to forget her sorrow and laugh by lifting her robe and exposing her pudenda. This comic scene is full of sexual innuendo, suggesting that Iambe or Baubo's jokes involved some kind of ventriloquizing vagina, as seen in these terracotta figures here on the left of Baubo Iambe from Anatolia. Although less explicit, the author of the Homeric hymn seems to be aware of the profane, jocular character of Iambe's jokes. And it does make a lot of sense that Demeter's grief was so deep that only a ventriloquizing vagina could bring her to smile or even laugh. Metaneira now filled a cup with wine and gave it to Demeter, but she refused it. It was not right for her, she said, to drink red wine, perhaps indicating the Greeks' consciousness that for the deepest states of mourning, alcohol only makes it worse. She asked them instead to give her a drink of barley meal and water mixed with tender pennyroyal, which they did with a suppliant's prayer. This is the famous drink of Demeter, known as the Kukaion, of which the philosopher Heraclitus says that it stays still while moving. Since Albert Hofmann's first discovery of LSD in the 1950s and the psychedelic revolutions of the 60s and beyond, the question of what exactly is in this Kukaion has been a subject of much scholarly debate. Secrecy regarding the Kukaion's preparations and ingredients was an enduring feature of the Eleusinian cult, and so it would be quite naive to believe that this short and innocent list of ingredients, some barley, tender pennyroyal, mint, perhaps suggestive of some kind of beer, tells us much at all about how to make it, and whether it had psychoactive properties analogous to but separate from that of wine. We'll be looking into the current research on the ingredients in the Kukaion later in this lecture after completing our reading of Demeter's hymn. After an exchange of speeches, Metaneira hires Doso to nurse her child Demophon. With these words, Demeter received the infant child in her fragrant bosom and immortal arms, and the mother rejoiced in her heart. Thus the fine son of prudent Keleos, to whom Metaneira gave birth, was nurtured by her in the palace, and he grew up like a god, not eating food or nursing at his mother's breasts. As if he were the child of a god, Demeter anointed him with ambrosia, holding him to her bosom and breathing on him sweetly. Having gone through a transitional rite from sorrow to smiling and laughter, the drinking of the Kukaion and the assumption of a new life and identity, Demeter is now at the stage of grief for her lost Persephone, in which she takes pleasure in a surrogate child, this time a mortal baby boy. Demophon, as the firstborn son, would be more than normally cherished, the only son and inheritor of the palace of Keleos. Since infant mortality was very high, an old woman with Doso's experience raising children would have been highly valued, and thus Metaneira promises Doso great rewards if she succeeds in nurturing him to maturity. At night, she hid him like a firebrand in the blazing fire, secretly from his dear parents, as if she were burning away the dross of mortality within him. And to the parents it was like a miracle how he blossomed forth and looked like the gods. And she would have made him ageless and immortal, thinking foolish thoughts and keeping watch by night from her fragrant chamber. Had not seen her, she raised a cry, striking her thighs in fear for her child. And blindness entered her mind, and weeping she spoke these winged words. Demophon, my child, this stranger hides you in a great fire, bringing me grief and painful care. Other accounts and myths say that the child's name was Triptolemos, and in Plutarch's account of the myth of Isis and Osiris, Isis performs this same function as maidservant in disguise, who immortalizes the son of the queen Astarte, first with the food of the gods and then by burning away the dross of his mortality in an immortal fire, which has led to much identification of Demeter and Persephone with Isis. In Metaneira's speech, the instinctive protectiveness of mortal mothers is underlined, as a great stupidity, which here results in Demeter's wrath and Demophon remaining forever immortal. In the next scene, we find Demeter's rebuke of Metaneira and self-revelation. Demeter's rebuke here really summing up the essence of the wisdom of this goddess. Mortals are ignorant and stupid. If there is one sentence to remember of Demeter's wisdom from this Homeric hymn, this would be it. Mortals are ignorant and stupid who cannot foresee the fate both of the good and the bad that is in store. In another translation, men are too foolish to know ahead of time the measure of good and evil that is in store. Well, we all know we're ignorant and stupid creatures, right? What is special about Demeter's pronouncement here is that she gives a very compelling reason why this is so. We are ignorant and stupid because we act impulsively out of either ignorance or stupidity, and cannot see the future. Above all, we cannot see the relation of the good and the bad, mourning and joy in our very own lives. We're constantly addicted to weighing things on the scale of our values, this good, that bad, this mournful, that joyous, but we seldom see the wider and the fuller perspective. The way the good and bad are always intertwined in a mortal life, how great blessings come ever with great sufferings, in a future that cannot be foreseen and whose inherent necessity and inevitability remains a closed book to us. It is not only our finitude and death which blocks our vision of the true meaning of each event and its future, but it is the fact that beyond this we are more ignorant and stupid even than we might be. Notice here that Demeter does not express any particular care or affection for human beings. She drops Demophon on the ground and gives him not another thought, and even alludes to his later life perhaps being shortened by impending battles. Later in the hymn, she will announce that she would have destroyed the whole human race. She expresses no empathy for Metaneira, despite her hospitality and her having nurtured Demophon, her infant son. It does seem that Demeter's only interest in the immortalization of Demophon was to create a kind of substitute for Persephone. When this wish fulfillment is shattered by Metaneira's discovery, her interest shifts again, first to the return of Persephone and to the founding of her mysteries in Eleusis. And so Demeter goes on, "Thus you, Metaneira, in your foolishness, have done a thing that cannot be remedied." Demeter might have continued to make Demophon immortal, but having been discovered, the strict separation of gods and mortals must now and again be observed. And so Demeter swears a great oath. "I call to witness by the relentless waters of the Styx the oath of the gods, that I would have made your dear child immortal, never to grow old all his days. I would have granted him imperishable honor, but now, as it is, he will not be able to escape death and the fates." That's the bad news, but now Demeter breaks the good. "But in due time, and as the years revolve for him, the sons of the Eleusinians will join in war and dreadful battle against each other." That's the first bad fate, and now here's the even worse one. "But in due time, and as the years revolve for him, the sons of the Eleusinians will join in war and dreadful battle against each other forever," perhaps indicating cognizance of the impending war with the Athenians nearby. And also gives the good news. And now Demeter reveals herself, "I am Demeter, the honored, the greatest benefit and joy to undying gods and to mortals. But come now, let all the people build me a great temple, and beneath it an altar under the steep walls of the city, above Callicoron on the rising hill. I myself shall introduce the rites, so that later you may propitiate my heart by their right performance." Now Demeter restores her true appearance. With these words, the goddess changed her size and form and sloughed off old age, as beauty wafted about her. From her fragrant veils a lovely smell emanated, and from the immortal skin of the goddess a light shone afar, as her blonde hair streamed down over her shoulders, and the sturdy mansion was filled with radiance as if from lightning. The queen staggered, and she remained speechless for a long time, forgetting to pick up her growing child from the floor. The daughters eventually pick her up and tend to the infant and the fire. And all night long the whole house propitiated the glorious goddess, quaking with fear. When Kelios, the father of the house, hears of Demeter's epiphany, he then called the assembly of people in every district and bade them build an opulent temple to lovely-haired Demeter and make an altar on the rising hill. And they listened to his speech, and obeying forthwith, They built it as he ordered, and the temple took shape according to divine decree. Now, when they finished the temple and refrained from labor, each man went to his home. But blonde Demeter, sitting there apart from all the blessed ones, kept on wasting away with longing for her deep-girded daughter. Having revealed herself and now living as a goddess among mortals with her temple already built, Demeter's rebellion would be eternal if not for the return of her daughter. And onto the much-nourishing earth she brought a year most dreadful and harsh for men. No seed in the earth sprouted, for fair-wreathed Demeter concealed it. In other words, the goddess did not allow seeds to sprout. And she would have destroyed the whole race of mortal men with painful famine, and would have deprived the Olympians of the glorious honors of gifts and sacrifices, if Zeus had not perceived this and pondered in his mind. It's interesting that Demeter finally gets Zeus's attention because of her very real and imminent threat to destroy the whole human race, the goddess of earth having made all seeds infertile, and thereby depriving the Olympians of the Hosios as the correct relation of gods and mortals through gift and sacrifice. Demeter herself, you remember, being the most graciously generous, the giver among the gods, even in her mortal form as Doso. Zeus, like Demeter here, seems unconcerned with the fate of mortals in and of themselves, and much more worried about the end of the glorious honors given to the gods. Zeus's honor is paramount here, not his concern for humanity. Here the Olympians do care about humanity and the proper balance of relationships between the immortal and the mortal world. Does this perhaps mean, ultimately, that the Olympian gods, transcendent and withdrawn, are in fact nothing more in the consciousness of this poet than the other side or face of the mortals, dependent in some way on the vicissitudes of mortal life and its contact with the sacred? We probably can't go so far as positing a primordial unity and difference of gods and mortals in the hymn, but Zeus's care for mortal sacrifice is here quite a lot more concerned and involved than, for example, in the Prometheus myth. First, Zeus sends Iris as a messenger to dark-robed Demeter at Eleusis, but Demeter's heart remained unswayed. Iris, being a relatively minor goddess and the herald of Hera, this gesture on Zeus's part bespeaks his ongoing lack of truly political consciousness over the events that are transpiring, perhaps almost an insult to Demeter. Thereupon, Zeus, realizing his folly, we might imagine, sent down to Demeter all of the blessed gods who exist forever, and they came one by one, but no one was able to sway her mind and her heart from her anger, and she stubbornly rejected all appeals. The fact that Zeus sends each of the Olympian gods to visit her and plead is a precursor here of the ritual reality of her mysteries at Eleusis, at which all the gods attend, each performing a distinctive role. Demeter's grievance with Zeus is far more serious, however, and could be ameliorated by any of these blessed gods, and she maintained that she would never set foot on fragrant Olympus or allow fruit to sprout from the earth until she saw with her own eyes her lovely daughter. This is a standoff in a hostage situation, and Demeter's power here is so great that in fact she wins the negotiation, Hermes Psychopompos being sent to fetch Persephone from Hades, who agrees to the visit. Here Demeter as well becomes the matriarchal goddess of politics and diplomacy. As Colosso tells the scenes leading up to Persephone's ascent, or Anados, hearing that the Olympians had need of him, Hades, with a gesture of kindness, turned to Persephone. His hand touched her arm, and that arm communicated a mute disquiet. He told her, in the presence of the Olympian messenger Hermes, that of course she could go back to her mother, but she would have to preserve her serenity. Again, his words sounded mysterious and ironic, because until now Persephone had never been serene with Hades. Then he urged her not to be ashamed of her husband. In the end, he was a great king, and he had made her a queen. Persephone, who had been sitting motionless on her throne for days, leapt to her feet like a little girl, her face lit up with joy. She wanted to leave now. And so, as the hymn tells us, Hades agrees, and wise Persephone rejoiced and swiftly sprang up for joy. But he himself had gave her to eat a honey-sweet pomegranate seed, contriving secretly about her, so that she might not spend all her days with dark-robed, revered Demeter. Persephone will later confess to her mother. Hades forced her to eat the pomegranate, even putting the seeds in her mouth. At last, Persephone ascends with Hermes on Hades' golden chariot towards Eleusis, suggesting that Hades is in fact present in the final scenes as well. And neither the sea nor streams of rivers, nor grassy glens, nor mountaintops impeded the onrush of the immortal horses as they cut through the deep air above in their course. This is the scene of Persephone's ascent, or Anodos. As Athanasicus notes in Ovid's version of this tale in the Metamorphoses, Persephone is not given the fruit by the god of the underworld, but she finds it in the garden and eats 7 seeds herself. The pomegranate was widely used in both ritual and folk medicine, but the poet of this hymn likely chose the plant because of its definite chthonic connections. In other myths, the tree was thought to have sprung from the blood of Dionysus Zagreus, as we hear in Clement of Alexandria, and pomegranate seeds are still used by the Greeks as decorations and in wheat offerings offered in memorial services for the dead. The symbolism of Persephone eating the pomegranate has also been much explored in archetypal psychology. The labyrinthine red fruit of many seeds, each of them a globule of blood enclosing a hard center or seed, is suggestive of Persephone's future role as queen of the underworld and judge of souls. We might say speculatively that having tasted the blood of the soul, the sheath surrounding the seed of the pomegranate, Persephone is already here prepped by Hades to be the legitimate master of her realm, and perhaps even to thrive in her new position. In other world mythologies as well, some even earlier, descent and reascent from the underworld is either impossible or becomes more impossible if one has dined among the dead. After the Anodos of Cora with Hermes in Hades' chariot, at the sight of her daughter, Demeter rushed like a Maenad down a mountain thick with wood. This is, after the Anodos, the scene of the reunion in mother and daughter, and in it Demeter is portrayed undeniably as a Bacchic reveler, a Maenad in her joy. When Persephone on the other side saw the beautiful eyes of her mother, she leapt down from the chariot with its horses and ran, throwing her arms around her neck in an embrace. Demeter, however, is afraid and asks if Persephone ate any food while in the underworld. Persephone replies, "But Hades swiftly put in my mouth the fruit of the pomegranate, a honey-sweet morsel, and compelled me to eat it by force against my will." She then tells the tale of her abduction in her own words, emphasizing her deep anguish and pain. In the most touching lines of the hymn, thus they, in mutual love and tender embraces, greatly cheered each other's hearts and souls the whole long day. Their grief was assuaged as they exchanged their joys. And importantly, Hecate, her hair brilliantly arrayed, approached them and frequently embraced the holy daughter of Demeter, and from that time on, regal Hecate became the lady and attendant of Persephone, this often being taken as the origin myth for Hecate's underworld connections and role similar to Hermes of a psychopompos into or out of the underworld. That the reunion of Demeter and Persephone involves a third goddess, and thus a triple goddess here, was also taken in later times to be the originary or form of the triple goddess idea itself. Although not much can really be drawn from this, see here the lecture on Artemis, Selene, and Hecate. At this point, after the reunion and finally, Zeus sends a qualified negotiator to negotiate the deal with Demeter and broker a lasting peace. He sends, quote, Rhea of the lovely hair to lead dark-robed Demeter back to the company of the gods. Rhea seems to be the only major goddess among the Olympian elite who wasn't in some way in cahoots with Zeus's plan for Persephone's abduction. Her opinion matters, and Demeter is often syncretized in later myth with Rhea and Rhea Cybele. The offer Rhea proposes is now that Persephone will live above the ground for 2/3 of the year with Demeter, only going back to be with Hades during the coldest winter months. Clearly, this is the first good deal that Demeter might in fact accept. In exchange, Demeter must allow the seeds to sprout and break their husks again, really not asking very much in return. Demeter agrees and then goes to the kings of Eleusis, Triptolemeus, Diocles, Eumolpus, and Callias, and now she shows them the performance of her holy rites and teaches her mysteries to them all. Holy mysteries that one may not by any means violate or question or express. This is the first literary appearance of the araton or prohibition of revealing the mysteries, here taught directly by Demeter. For great reverence is due to the gods and restrains one's voice. Demeter, Persephone, and Hecate celebrate their final reunion at lines 430 to 440. Having restored fertility, Demeter's next move is to establish her mystery, so these events which have transpired will never be forgotten. Athanasicus notes how of all the explanations for Persephone's sojourn in Hades for 1/3 of the year, the ancient Stoic doctrine that this period stood for the time during which the seeds are hidden in the ground is certainly the most logical and plausible. One might add that the Greek winter lasts for about 1/3 of the year. The Greek word used when Demeter shows the performance of her holy rites to the kings, now priests of Eleusis, is dresmosune, enactment or performance, and it may refer to the sacred drama of Demeter and Persephone being acted out by priests during the mystery initiations. And the prohibition on revealing the mysteries uses the word euphemiti, literally to keep reverent silence. Literally to keep reverent silence, i.e. never to discuss or reveal what takes place or is shown. Winding to its conclusion, the Homeric hymn turns to a description of the blessings granted by Demeter and her mysteries. Happy is the one of mortals on earth who has seen these things, and those who are uninitiated into the holy rites and have no part never are destined to a similar joy when they are dead in the gloomy realm below. Extremely similar remarks can be found in Pindar, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, and Plato's Phaedrus at 69c. The hymn concludes, "But when the goddess of goddesses had ordained all these things, they made their way to Olympus among the company of the other gods. There they dwell beside Zeus, who delight in the thunder, august and holy goddesses." What this clearly means, although it's seldom underlined, is that Persephone and probably Hecate also spend the bulk of their time on Olympus, and we must thus imagine not only a chthonic Persephone of the underworld, but also an Olympian Persephone, and even to understand Demeter as the goddess of goddesses among all Olympian goddesses. Greatly happy is the one of mortals on earth whom they dearly love, for straightway they send as a guest to his great house Plutus, who gives wealth to human beings. This reference to Plutus, like in Hesiod's myth, seeming to be a separate god from Pluto as Hades, god of the underworld. The conclusion of the magnificently beautiful Homeric hymn to Demeter reads, "But come now, you who dwell in the fragrant town of Eleusis, sea-girt Pyrrhus and rocky Antron, mighty mistress Dia, bringer of seasons and splendid gifts, both you and your daughter, beauteous Persephone, for my song kindly grant me possessions pleasing the heart, and I shall remember you and another song too." The poet thus concluding on the power of Demeter to grant agricultural wealth and prosperity. Let's look now to other versions of this myth than in the canonical Homeric hymn. Many other locations have been proposed by various traditions for the site of Persephone's abduction, and also for Demeter's founding of her mysteries. On Argos, her hosts were not Metaneira and Kelios, but Pelasgos and Chrysanthus. In the main version, King Kelios' name may mean the woodpecker, which might point back to kingly rule over a forest dwelling or pre-agricultural population. In the Orphic version, at least from the rumors of it we have in fragmentary testimony, Demeter encounters 5 autochthonous mortals on her way to Eleusis from Athens, including Baubo, Deusaulus, Triptolemos, and Euboleus. Sometimes it is Triptolemos who informed Demeter what had happened to Persephone, not Helios or Hecate, which may account for his frequent depiction alongside Demeter as receiving the gift of grain as his reward. Sometimes Demeter refuses even to drink the koukayon, and it is Baubo, not Iambe, who attempts to make the goddess smile so that she will have a sip. Perhaps the first scene of force-feeding a medicinal drink to a goddess, and here Baubo reveals the smiling child Iacchos either in her belly or in her vagina, growing in her womb. It may also be that in earlier versions of this hymn, Demeter herself descended to the underworld, meeting with and enlisting characters like Baubo, Deusaulus, or Euboleus along the way. This version may well go back to Ishtar's descent myths in Mesopotamia. Another difference in some other versions is that Persephone's return is guided and attended by a retinue, not just Hades and Hermes, a retinue that might include the Moirai or Fates, the Horai or Seasons, the Charites or Graces, a set of 9 dancers, as well as Aphrodite, who may also be present alongside or other than Hecate in comforting the sorrowing Demeter. As to the various interpretations of the Homeric hymn to Demeter that have been proposed, basically every camp in the theory of myth has been successfully applied to this hymn. Jungian readers such as Jung himself or Karenyi focus on the mother, the maiden, the child, or the crone archetypes within it, or even on Rhea as the wise old woman, or Hades as the shadow, and finally on Iacchos after the reunion of Demeter and Persephone as the self. Freudian readers wish to see it as a wish fulfillment fantasy, for human mothers must have wished that they could have unmarried their daughters. Human mothers can't perform this miracle, of course, but Demeter more or less can. The deal that results being incredibly favorable to Demeter and Persephone, Persephone ending up quite happy in her role as Queen of the Dead, the most respected wife of a god as great as Hades, equal to Zeus or Poseidon, but a husband to which she owed little fidelity, even little time. Persephone spending most of her time on Olympus, frolicking in the fields with her lover Adonis, and only having to go back to work judging souls for 3 months of the year. The myth of Demeter and Persephone is about the triumph of divine feminine life over the death drive and the structures of patriarchy. Structuralists find many contradictions in this myth to mediate the acceptance of death versus the desire for life, the desire to remain a child versus the acceptance of marriage. And feminist interpreters also find much to analyze in this myth, and tend to emphasize the fact that this hymn is told almost entirely from the perspective of women, and how Demeter is the only Olympian goddess to successfully rebel against Zeus. On the other hand, this hymn has been critiqued from a feminist perspective in its justification of the abduction, followed by ascent of Persephone as valid models. What this story is really about is a compromise and delimiting of Demeter's matriarchal powers. Yes, it's cool that Demeter still continued to have such powers under the Greek patriarchy, but ultimately this was only possible within a capitulation to it. In the myth of Demeter and Persephone and the rites of Eleusis, the Greeks basically took the most patriarchy-eroding part of their religious tradition and turned it into a patriarchy-safe, happily ever after version. Beyond even this feminist criticism, more contemporary interpreters have looked to Demeter in order to articulate maternal theory, for the question, who is the mother, asked by Derrida in a seminal essay, has still not been adequately addressed or answered. Demeter, in fact, lends her name to the main scholarly press responsible for publication in maternal theory, including the approaches of matricentric feminism, maternal subjectivity, maternal narratology, maternal ambivalence and regret, migrant mothers, and you can check out here demeterpress.org. Let's talk now about what is known about the Eleusinian mysteries themselves, which were in operation for between 1500 and 2500 years. The Homeric hymn, while not a secret document, remains the single most important and ancient piece of evidence for the mythic etiologies underlining the Eleusinian religion. The sanctuary at Eleusis can be compared to the Vatican of the ancient world, perhaps as important, if not on some occasions more important than Delphi, and mysteries of Demeter and Cora at Eleusis can be compared to Cybele and Attis cult, Dionysian and Orphic cult, and even Egyptian cults of Isis and Osiris. Initiates at Eleusis included some of the most high-profile people in Hellenic history, including famous poets and philosophers like Pindar, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Plato, and Aristotle. Each, without breaking their oath of secrecy, write extremely positively of their initiatory experiences there. Alas, we have substantive testimony about what took place during the night of the greater mysteries only because of the testimony of later Christian authors, like Clement of Alexandria, who seems to have got himself initiated precisely to debunk the mysteries. Nevertheless, the mysteries were very popular and continued unabated, undergoing many renaissances until they were officially shut down by Emperor Theodosius in 392 CE. Importantly, at Eleusis, at least during some periods of its operation, initiation was not restricted to men, but might include women and slaves. Prerequisites were simply being not a murderer and speaking Greek, and also, of course, being able to afford them. Orpheus is often credited with originating the mysteries, more on that next week, and most scholars agree there were two sets of mysteries which took place, the lesser and the greater. The lesser mysteries were preliminary initiations in the spring, where the initiate was named Mustes, or the blind one. Muein meaning to initiate, but also to close the eyes. The Greek words mustes and muein are related to muesis, purificatory ritual, and the mustai, or initiates, are put in a state of pathos by the guidance of what was called the mustagogoi, the initiator, probably the hierophant or priest, but also his assistants at the temple. The greater mysteries, or full initiation, occurred likely at the beginning of fall, and this initiate is referred to as an epoptes, a viewer or one who has seen. Here and in other testimony, epopteia refers to having been fully initiated, and thus having contemplated the living paintings consisting of gestures, words, and sacred objects that were shown at Eleusis, in the words of Giorgio Agamben, who we'll turn to soon. Some scholars postulate the existence of a deeper and final stage of initiation as well. We'll be looking into this with Kevin Clinton in week 14. As to the size of the Eleusinian Festival of the Greater Mysteries in the fall, according to some testimony, the population of Eleusis, usually no more than a few thousand during the off-season, would have swelled to anywhere from 5,000 to 20,000 people during the month of Boedromion, with anywhere from several hundred to a few thousand being initiated at once in the grand finale in the Telesterion, the temple first erected by the Athenians, which replaced the earlier smaller temple to Demeter with a wooden image of her statue inside. Here's an image of the archaeological site of Eleusis during Roman times, including the well of Callicoron, where Demeter first appeared as Doso, the greater Propylaea, or gateway, which enters into the sanctuary, the Plutonion, or gateway to the underworld, the realm of Hades, at the site of Eleusis, and the Telesterion with the Anaktoron inside. More on that soon. In classical times, during the season of the Greater Mysteries, a holy truce was declared for a period of 55 days, and heralds were sent to issue invitations to all the poli, or city-states of Hellas. Both Athens and Eleusis were involved in the administration of the festival. Before the beginning of the festival, the Hieria, or sacred objects, were taken on a ritual procession to the Athenian Eleusinion. The testimony suggests that the festival of the Greater Mysteries took place over 9 days. On the first day, people assembled in the Athenian Agora, the pure and Greek-speaking ones maybe being invited into the mysteries. The second day involving a cleansing in the sea. The third, various sacrifices and prayers. The fourth day, devotions to Asclepius. On the fifth day, there was a procession back to Eleusis with the Hieria and the cult statue of Iacchos, perhaps a form of the infant Dionysus, which is said to have included ritual abuse and jest and a torchlit procession to the Telesterion. The sixth to the eighth day involved the secret core of the mysteries and the final breaking of the fast with the Kukaion, followed by the initiations themselves and their celebration, and the ninth day, a return to Athens. As to what took place in the Telesterion, we do know that the drinking of the Kukaion was involved, and that the Kukaion was administered by sacred assistants of the priesthood. This is thought to have been followed by a dramatic reenactment of the myth, and perhaps a simulated journey to the underworld, including the sublime terrors and joys of Tartarus and the Elysian fields, perhaps a sacred marriage underground. We hear about the revelation of various sacred objects by the priests, which are bathed in mystic light and accompanied with magical utterances on the part of the Hierophant, whose name means the one who shows sacred things, that is the Hieria, or sacred objects of the cult. We also know that the Telesterion included within it the Anaktoron, a small rectangular stone structure with a burning fire, either at its center or above. The ceremony was said to have taken place in darkness until the Anaktoron opened and the chief priest appeared. At this point, the abduction of Persephone and the wanderings of Demeter are thought to have been dramatically reenacted. The revelation of the Greater Mysteries was followed by a night of celebration, including a dance in the meadow of choral dancers nearby, and then, or during the next morning, the joyous procession of Iacchos, god of the mystery cry. For more on the comparison of the Eleusinian mysteries of Demeter with other mystery cults in the ancient Greek world, we can do no better than reading Walter Burkert's synoptic and accessible short study, Ancient Mystery Cults. Here on the left, you see a relief in which Demeter holds a sacred object, likely agricultural, and definitely appearing in the shape of a mushroom. And here on the right, a classic scene of initiation with the mustes, or one being initiated with a veil over his head. Exactly what took place during the Eleusinian Mysteries has been the subject of much discussion. An early study still worth reading is the Eleusinian and Bacchic Mysteries by Thomas Taylor, and also representation in Western art. Painters have frequently attempted to give us a sense of Eleusinian celebration. Alas, our best source of evidence for what actually took place remains the Christian Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century CE, who tells us that the heart of the mysteries consisted in the revelation of an ear of grain, and perhaps a sexual union of the Hierophant and the priestess of Demeter. Despite his intentions to debunk and expose, much that Clement relates remains very interesting to scholars. Quote, "The symbols of initiation to these rites when set before you in a vacant hour, I know will excite your laughter, although on account of the exposure by no means inclined to laugh. I have eaten out of the drum, I have drunk out of the cymbal, I have carried the cernos, which may be a vessel containing poppy, I have slipped into the bedroom. Are these tokens not a disgrace? Are not the mysteries pure absurdity?" Unquote. The following is the token of the Eleusinian mysteries. "I have fasted, I have drunk from the cup, I have received from the box, having done, I put it into the basket, out of the basket into the chest. Fine sights, truly, and becoming a goddess. Mysteries worthy of the night and flame, and the magnanimous, rather silly people that the Greeks are." And yet more of Clement's invectives, quote, "O unblushing shamelessness! Once on a time night was silent, a veil for the pleasure of temperate men, but now for the initiated, the holy night is the telltale of the rites of licentiousness, and the glare of torches reveals vicious indulgences. Quench the flame, O Hierophant! Reverence, O torchbearer, the torches! That light exposes Aeacus. Let thy mysteries be honored, and command the orgies to be hidden in night and darkness." 2 centuries later, Clement would have his wish fulfilled here and the mystery sanctuaries closed. Clement's testimony remaining through to our own day, the best testimony we have for what took place. Scholars continue to debate at length every aspect of Clement's testimony. Did some sort of sacred hierogamy occur at Eleusis? Seems to be an open question, but most accept that the Hierophant's Dresmosune or initiatory performance did involve revealing of an ear of grain, and that a chest of sorts or cernos was employed and contained various symbole or tokens of the ceremony. Clearly Clement's intentions here is to defame the salvific quality of initiation at Eleusis. It does not lead to the blessed fate in the afterlife that is hoped for, but is a silly rite worthy of such children as the Greek people are. What they should do is give up their Eleusinian mysteries, which are no more than rites of licentiousness or Bacchic orgies. They should abjure these rites and instead adopt Christianity and salvation through Jesus Christ. On the other most central god at Eleusis, other than Demeter and Persephone, Aeacus, god of the mystery shout, he is often closely connected by scholars to Dionysus Zagreus, a hypothesis which is supported when we read Nonnus's Dionysica, and which was first argued for in Friedrich Kusser's Symbolique, still untranslated, and also in Schelling's later Philosophy of Mythology. The Eleusinian mysteries may indeed be quite Orphic in character, and we'll examine the evidence for that next week, as Milonas sums up the mysteries in his classic study. Whatever the substance and meaning of the mysteries was, the fact remains that the cult of Eleusis satisfied the most sincere yearnings and deepest longings of the human heart. The initiates returned from their pilgrimage to Eleusis full of joy and happiness, with their fear of death diminished and a stronger hope for a better life in the world of the shadows. Thrice happy are those of mortals who, having seen these rites, departs for Hades, for to them alone it is granted to have true life there. To the rest all is evil, cries Sophocles, and to this Pindar with equal exultation answers, "Happy is he who, having seen these rites, goes below the hollow earth, for he knows the end of life, and he knows its God-sent beginning." For those interested in doing their essay projects on the Eleusinian rites, I recommend picking up Milonas's book, Eleusis and the Eleusinian Mysteries, and also Carl Karenyi's Eleusis, Archetypal Image of Mother and Daughter. Let's turn now to a brief tour of the archaeological site of Eleusis, as it was on one fine June day in 2019. Waking up from our Airbnb in downtown Athens, I thought it was a good sign that the breakfast cafe nearby had an odd form of breakfast Greek salad, whose main staple was barley groats, barley being Demeter's grain at Eleusis. The journey to Eleusis is only 15 or 20 minutes by car today, and it lies in an industrial area of the city, so one doesn't really expect it to be that wonderful and magnificent, but around the sanctuary there are walking streets and nice cafes, and the atmosphere once you're there is very wonderful. Entering through the gates, I was again amazed to see 3 young girls playing with toys and frolicking around, very much reminiscent of the daughters of Metanera, and nearby the Maiden's Well. Like at Delphi and in many places in Greece, stray dogs find among the archaeological ruins an adoptive home, reminding us of Hecate and her close relationship to dogs. Beautiful flowers bloom up in the midst of the stone relics, and a sacred aura still pervades the place. Eleusis, although hardly frequented by tourists compared to other sites, is really one of the most magnificent places to go. Here you see the Maiden's Well itself, with a single red flower, I thought it was a poppy, growing up from inside the well. As you begin the ascent towards the Telesterion, you first see this statue of Hadrian. Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius being two Roman emperors very dedicated to Eleusis, who invested significant funds in renovating the site during their reign. The next place you arrive at is the Plutonion, thought to be one of the entrances to Hades and his realm. And then you arrive at the Telesterion, or at least what remains of it, as well as of the Anactoron, clearly marked at its center. Milonis's excavations were fairly extensive, but with sufficient grant money there would still be much more to explore and unearth at this site. A later emperor created this beautiful garden of the Telesterion, and it did feel like the most sacred place at the sanctuary today. This beautiful tree providing protection from the sun, and under it many stone slabs and pillars with inscribed writing, most of it describing the various people who were initiated and their contributions to the sanctuary. I'll confess that sitting in the garden of the Telesterion under this beautiful tree, I pulled out a little vape pen containing liquid dimethyltryptamine and went on a psychedelic journey through the land of Eleusis, just outside the Telesterion itself. What did I experience? Nothing less than the god Iacchos revealing that he was still very much alive and well at the site. Walking to the very peak of Eleusis, you find the museum there and some of the most excellently preserved artifacts found at the site. And inside the museum, these helpful models showing the reconstructed history of building that was proposed based on Milonis' studies. The grain, the cernos, the barrel, and the poppy do all seem to be sacred at Eleusis, although the meaning of each symbol discovered in the stone reliefs at Eleusis is still much debated. As Colasso summarizes the relation of Demeter and Persephone in the Eleusinian religion, quote, "What happened in Eleusis was the separation and the reunion of the dual goddess, Demeter Cora, Dio, a goddess that often appears as a barely differentiated figure cloaked in the same marble. It was the drama of the spiritual reflection that detaches itself from the body, from every object, from the earth even, precisely to be reunited with its origin, but only in certain recurrent moments, like eclipses. With the arrival of Cora, the marvelous passes from the object to the act of looking, just as at the beginning of her adventure, Cora looks at the narcissus, that wondrous radiant flower awesome to the sight of the gods and mortals alike. So too, at the end, when she returns from the underworld, Cora herself is a great wonder for gods and mortals alike. By repeating the same formula, the anonymous author of the Homeric hymn intended to underline the completion of an irreversible process, the passage to the soul. What the hymn dramatizes is the very conviviality of gods and mortals in finding wonder in exactly the same things, whether it be a narcissus flower or the ascent of the Cora, now queen of the underworld, Persephone. The formula alerts us to the fact that these events were sources of amazement, not just in the history of men, but in the history of gods as well. And Colasso goes on to explain the significance of this observation for the Eleusinian mysteries in general. What happened at Eleusis was nothing less than a world historical event, an event of the human and divine soul. For, quote, "In the past, few had had the privilege of being led by a god to the Elysian fields with their bodies still intact, and Hades was defined as that place where there is no body. But now, along with Cora's body, Eros penetrated the kingdom of the dead. The slender-ankled Persephone was the supple arrow Aphrodite ordered Eros to let fly at Hades when the goddess summoned her son to the black rock of Eryx, the rock at the edge of the underworld. From now on, it was a question not only of accepting life in a single immutable form, but of accepting the certainty that that form would one day disappear without a trace. Demeter's anger is the revolt against this new regime of life, but the goddess didn't know that at the same moment, a new regime of death was also being inaugurated. For when Persephone took her place on Hades' throne and her scented face peeped out from behind the spiky beard of her partner, when Persephone bit into the pomegranate that grew into the shadow gardens. Death itself underwent a transformation every bit as radical as that which life had undergone when it had been deprived of the girl. The two kingdoms of above and below, of Olympus and Hades, were thrown radically off balance in this myth, and each opened anew as if for the first time to the other. Hades imposed an absence on the earth, the absence of Persephone, and even the absence of Demeter's fructifying powers of fertility. This created a situation where every presence was now enveloped in an even greater cloak of absence. Persephone's descent to the underworld and ascent from it literally transforms the underworld itself, for she imposed living blood on the dead, not as in the past, the dark blood of sacrifice that the dead drink so thirstily, but the invisible blood that went on pulsing in her white arms of life, the blood of someone who is still entirely alive, even in the palace of death. And for Colasso, this points to the secret Dionysian nature of Demeter, Persephone, and of the Eleusinian mysteries. Dionysus was not the only god who'd had to ask a man the way to Hades, for when Demeter was searching for Cora, she asked Celeus, king of Eleusis, where she might find her daughter, and Celeus pointed the way to Hades. As a reward, she not only gave him the secret of bread, but in this most obscene of Demeter's myth, she even allowed him to possess her body illicitly. Colasso comments on this strange variant that it's not the father of the church, Clement of Alexandria, who gives us the details this time, but an obscure scholiast. Gregory of Nazianzus is ashamed even to mention those certain things that Demeter does and submits to, and Gregory had good reason to be scandalized. Demeter is the goddess of the thesmoi, the strictest of laws, and here she is agreeing to give herself athesmos, lawlessly, to a mortal. Colasso goes on, the goddess's humiliation took place in Eleusis, and marked an irreversible turning point in the history of the Olympians. Instead of attempting to defend Demeter's honor and integrity from the obscene exposition of her mysteries in Clement or Gregory, Colasso fully accepts the idea of the goddess's humiliation. Demeter is humiliated not only in the loss of her daughter to Hades, but as well in her becoming like Hades, dead to and forgetful of her own nature as an Olympian goddess. Demeter's humiliation is a uniting of her very nature not only with Hades and the death of her daughter, but also with Dionysus, the rebirth of invincible life. Here, Colasso speaks about the Eleusinian crisis, that is, the crisis brought about by the religion of Eleusis, the Olympian theology and order of things. It is through Persephone's descent and ascent, and Demeter's wandering, taking the shape of a mortal, and holding Olympus hostage, that not only mortals but also the gods became fascinated with the soulful mysteries of death and resurrection. To find out more about the nature of death, the gods turned to men, death being the one thing men knew rather more about than they did. And to get help from men in experiencing the nature of death, both Dionysus and Demeter had to prostitute themselves. As Colasso explains this most profound of points, a god surrendering himself to a mortal is like a man surrendering himself to death. Every dead man has to bring a coin with him to pay his way to Hades. Gods don't use money, so they give their very bodies. The memory of this divine prostitution was buried deep in the mysteries, and we would know nothing of it were it not for the vindictive zeal of a father of the church and the loquacity of a scholiast. Although no sooner than these events had been disinterred from the silence, all kinds of other authors come running to confirm a complicity between Dionysus and Demeter vis-a-vis their love affairs on the road to Hades. And we can turn here to Brian C. Muraresco's book, The Immortality Key, The Secret History of the Religion with No Name. For in 2020, while the world was on lockdown from the COVID-19 pandemic, this book became a New York Times bestseller. I was initially skeptical, especially since Muraresco is a self-confessed psychedelic virgin with the accessible writing style for a general audience, and most of the scholarship won me over pretty fast. In the course pack this week, you'll find 4 chapters of this book, the most important one for the study of Demeter and Persephone at Eleusis being chapter 4. In this reading, the basic experience of initiation at Eleusis is appearing behind the veil of nature into eternal spiritual reality. And most importantly, Muraresco provides a summary for the general reader of the history of scholarship and current evidence that the potion or koukayon of Demeter was a psychedelic concoction. As we heard in the Homeric hymn, the Kukaion was barley-based, a mixture including water, tender leaves of mint, or pennyroyal, and this means it was likely a beer. Carl P. Rook, in his book on Eleusis, was the first to propose that the psychoactive component of the Kukaion was ergot, which contains LSA, a natural precursor of LSD, which is water-soluble in the fungus. The mint was likely needed to cut the bitter taste. Muraresco speculates that the three specific ingredients of the Kukaion given in the Homeric hymn can thus be explained. 1. Ergotized barley, swimming with all kinds of alkaloids, some psychoactive. 2. Water to separate the useful alkaloids from the toxic alkaloids. And 3. Mint to cut the bitter, acrid taste known to accompany alkaloid mixtures. Again, like in the unit last week on Dionysus, if you're interested in this topic for your essay project, you can pick up Carl P. Rook's books or edited volumes. Most basically now in a diagram drawn from Muraresco, kernels of ergot or Claviceps purpurea sprout like so from a spike of cereal grain. Once the slender, hardened spur known as the sclerotium falls to the ground, the fungus will begin its fruiting phase under warm, wet conditions, sending up tiny, purple-colored mushrooms. These are neurotoxic and poisonous and have infected many a field of wheat or barley grain in the Middle Ages, resulting in St. Vitus's dancing frenzy and villages going mad. However, handled correctly, the LSA that they contain can be extracted in a water-based solution and the toxicity minimized. If Muraresco, here building on the work of especially Carl Rook, is correct, then for the Greeks, the secret of secrets, the initiations at Eleusis, and the manufacture of the Kukaion was in part an agricultural and in part a biochemical tradition. Quote, the harvesting of ergot-infected grain and the mixing of the sacrament are believed to represent the origin of all human science at Eleusis, a science which here reveals the mysteries of death and rebirth. According to Rook and Muraresco, it may be the agricultural mysteries of Demeter involved the careful cultivation of fields of grain or barley, in which the conditions for the propagation of ergot, but not its overwhelming and destroying of an entire field, were practiced, and the upshot of this is that ergot perhaps blighting crops, but also being able to live symbiotically with them under the correct conditions. The production of the basic ingredient of the magic potion was possible only when untamed nature lived in harmony with domesticated agriculture. My sense has been that, like Greek oenology and viticulture, the full list of ingredients in the Kukaion may be quite a bit more complex even than this. The archaeological evidence for Demeter at the sanctuary of Eleusis and elsewhere at times appears to indicate not only more fully developed mushrooms like this, definitely not ergot, but also frequent literary invocations and images and statuary of the poppy. Barley or grain here involved was probably lightly fermented to produce a light beer. The final concoction, in my view, was probably, although there's insufficient evidence to speculate here, a mixture of a light beer, mint, pennyroyal, or other ingredients for flavor. And psychoactively, it might have involved LSA, psilocybin mushrooms, and opium. Don't do this at home, people, but the experienced psychonaut and pharmacologist can tell you quite easily that when you combine LSD with psilocybin mushrooms and opium without blunting the effect through excessive alcohol, what you end up with is an incredibly powerful hallucinogenic concoction. In trying to explain how hundreds or thousands of people in the Telesterion in the Night of the Great Mysteries all drunk the Kukaion, and all agreed that the sacred vision that they saw during the performances by the Hierophant and the initiators be the most mystical, profound experiences of their lives and fully worthy of a sacred secrecy. I have been unable to avoid the conclusion that the opium kept the initiates sedate and receptive in a state of pathos, as Aristotle said, while the combination of the ergot and perhaps some variety of psilocybin mushroom brought on the most intense hallucinatory and phantasmagoric experiences of their lives. No wonder almost all initiates until Christianity considered initiation at Eleusis to be a must-have experience, and ultimately extremely different than ordinary wine intoxication in the cult of Dionysus. Yes, Dionysian vintages of wine might often mimic the Kukaion through the addition of various types of psychoactive plants or fungi, but what the Eleusinian technicians provided in the Kukaion was quite simply the most purified and refined form of psychedelic beverage that the ancient Greek world knew how to produce. and thus it was special enough and sacred enough for a complete prohibition on any type of reproduction of it or private use. Alcibiades being put on trial not only for defacing the Herms, but also for providing at his symposiums a homebrew version of the Kukaion, a drink whose psychoactive properties were simply so powerful that it was punishable by death or exile to reproduce this drink in any way, thus bringing it out of its sacred and into a profane context. For more on the pharmacology of the Kukaion, you can check out Carl P. Rook's 2 YouTube lectures on this. It is also very interesting that Demeter and Persephone, in high-level scholarship on these goddesses, are associated especially with the Western dichotomy of nature and spirit, and the EU-funded Greek government plans for the sanctuary at Eleusis appear to be following suit with this basic insight. By chance, when Muraresco went to Athens prior to publishing his work, there was an exhibition on Eleusis, the Great Mysteries, that had just taken place, a project of cultural revivification and ecotourism. The brochure he read in 2020. It is our hope that this exhibition will be the herald for the celebratory year 2021, when Eleusis will serve as the cultural capital of Europe. Within the captivating sacred silence of that site, we await the humming sounds of new initiates. This EU-funded project, which seems to have been put on hold by COVID, focused on 4 main themes. The Demeter or Mother Earth project focused on our relationship with food. 2, the Persephone program focusing on our relationship with urban green areas, gardens, and flowers. 3, the Ecoculture program focusing on climate change, energy, and recycling. And finally 4, the Feminine Nature program focusing on cultural heritage and femininity. Very 21st century, comments Muraresco. Muraresco sums up the meaning of the Eleusinian Mysteries by thinking of Vettius Agorius Praetextatus, a high-profile Roman aristocrat of the 4th century CE, a prefect, a consul, and a hierophant who held a number of respected political and religious positions in the Roman Empire. Like Cicero and Marcus Aurelius before him, Praetextatus was also initiated into the mysteries. He was one of those cosmopolitan Romans who felt there was something truly extraordinary about Eleusis. Whatever the sublime vision revealed about the nature of existence, there was more at stake than just personal salvation. Much more. Faced with the obliteration of the most sacred mysteries, Praetextatus declared that the short-sighted law would make the life of the Greeks unlivable. Having drunk the Kukaion and experienced the vision for himself, the priest points to Eleusis as the one place that holds the whole human race together, and even, as in Colosso, the whole of the human race with the pantheon of the gods. The Greek word used here for unlivable is abiotos, literally the absence or the opposite of life, bios. And Muraresco comments with Karenyi that it's a rare and evocative word, and one which Karenyi was fascinated by in his 1962 book on Eleusis, where he concludes that the word was consciously chosen to inform later generations the mysteries were, quote, connected not only with Athenian and Greek existence, but with human existence in general. According to Praetextatus, the Temple of Eleusis housed something indispensable that was utterly lacking in the Christian faith. Without that original sacrament, the Kukaion, inherited from the ancestors, we would all be doomed. Why, Muraresco asks, and how exactly did Demeter prevent not only Greek existence, but human existence from becoming unlivable? How did the goddess whom Rook refers to as the Earth Mother put our species in accord with nature? Muraresco's answer is that trained by the female elders, the priestesses would have overseen the cultivation of the fields at Eleusis. Rook sees the painstaking process as the thin line between the wild, nomadic ways of the prehistoric era and the civilized institutions rooted in Greek biotechnology and ethnopharmacology. The job of the priestesses, Rook contends, would have been to monitor closely the growth of the darnel and ergot so that neither got out of control. Too much and the deadly weed and fungus would ruin the crop, threatening life itself. Too little and there would be no active ingredient for the Kukaion. Only when chaos and cosmos work together do the raw psychedelic ingredients of the sacrament result. Under the visionary spell of the Kukaion, Persephone is thought to have revealed the mystery of death and rebirth directly to the initiates. And that's why Demeter set up the mysteries of Eleusis in the first place, so Persephone could establish a personal relationship with each of its pilgrims. In the underworld that had invaded Demeter's temple, they would witness Persephone give birth to a holy child, Iacchos, and maybe this vision, as many now believe, in fact was facilitated by the special combination of ingredients. The point is not to debunk the mysteries, if in fact they were psychedelically fueled. The point is that the initiates believed what they saw. They apparently couldn't explain away the vision as wacky hallucinations, rattled brain chemistry, or wishful thinking as we moderns tend to do. For those who had drunk the Kukaion, it was a peek into another freestanding reality. Let's turn now to a reading of the Orphic hymns to Demeter and Persephone. The 40th hymn to Eleusinian Demeter reads, Dio, divine mother of all, goddess of many names, revered Demeter, nurturer of youth, giver of prosperity and wealth, you nourish the ears of corn, giver of all. You delight in peace and in toilsome labor, present at the sowing, the heaping, and the threshing. O spirit of the unripe fruit, you dwell in the sacred valley of Eleusis. Charming and lovely, you give sustenance to all mortals. You are the first to yoke the plowing ox, the first to send up from below a rich and lovely harvest for mortals. You are growth and blooming, O illustrious companion of Bromios. Torch-bearing and pure, you delight in the summer's yield. From beneath the earth you appear, gentle to all. O holy and youth-nurturing lover of children and of the fair offspring, you yoke your chariot to bridled dragons. Round your thrones you whirl and howl in ecstasy. You have an only daughter, but you have many children and many powers over mortals. A variety of flowers reflect your myriad faces and your sacred blossoms. Come, O blessed and pure one, come with the fruits of summer and bring peace, bring the welcome rule of law, bring riches too and prosperity, and bring the health that governs all. Here the Orphic hymns, sometime in the 2nd century CE, give us their vision into Eleusinian Demeter. She is, like Apollo or Dionysus Akurotrophos, as the myth of Demophon shows, and an all-giving agricultural mystery goddess, and even a culture heroine like Prometheus, especially through her Eleusinian prince Triptolemos. She is strongly associated with Dionysus here, an illustrious companion of Bromios. Demeter is torch-bearing, referring here not only to her wandering search but to her nocturnal festivities, including Dionysian revels, in which she whirls and howls in ecstasy, and her highest functionaries or priests, the Dadoukos, are also torchbearers. She has her own chariot here, drawn by bridled dragons, which perhaps is an image that goes back to the myths of her original descent to the underworld, well before the recorded memory of the Homeric hymns. Demeter's chariot of dragons is here in any case the counter-image of Hades' golden chariot drawn by immortal horses. Like in the Homeric hymn, Demeter is described in extremely Maenatic terms, and although a mature woman, she has all the maidenly qualities of her daughter Persephone. After alluding to her many other children than Persephone, indicating she is far from a chaste goddess, the hymn concludes by associating Demeter with all blessings and benefactions for the well-being of mortals: flowers, blossoms, purity, fruit, summer peace, laws, riches, prosperity, and health. In other Orphic testimony and fragmentary evidence as well, Demeter is equated with the mother Rhea, who attempts to flee the amorous attentions of her son Zeus by transforming herself into a snake. Undeterred, an older, more titanic Zeus, identified with Hades' Zeus, does likewise, as well turns into a snake, and from this union was born Persephone, who in the Orphic myth is born with monstrous features that frighten her mother away, Persephone here being a kind of original Echidna. Athanasicus connects here the Arcadian story, in which Demeter turns herself into a horse to escape Poseidon, who follows suit. The Ophidian or serpent rape by Zeus has been diplomatically omitted from the Homeric hymn, from this Orphic hymn. Nevertheless, in Orphic sources, Hades or Aedes from Ace means house or palace, and is identified with Chthonic Zeus, subterranean Zeus, Hades originally being the form that Zeus took before he acquired his full Olympian powers. And so the quite Orphically inspired German Romantic poet Hölderlin, aware of these sources, speaks in his remarks on tragedy about two Zeuses: the Olympian Zeus who reverses all striving out of this world into another, into a striving out of another world into this one. This is the very core of what is achieved at Eleusis. Of this worldly perspective in which the unity and difference of gods and mortals mortals living divine life through their death, and the gods experiencing mortal death as divine life, becoming the form that Zeus religion took under Orphism, the Olympian Zeus now separating himself from his earlier more chthonic identity as Hades or Pluto, the hospitable lord of the departed. Although Orphic eschatology and afterworld beliefs are often identified as otherworldly, or as Erwin Rohde will say, a drop of alien blood in the otherwise this-worldly spirit of the Greeks, in fact, these suppositions are not borne out by a close reading of the Orphic hymns. All the Orphic hymns, in fact, including the Orphic hymns to Demeter, seem to far more emphasize a this-worldly attitude and affirmation of life. Demeter's radiance and abundance, and Persephone's descent and ascent are here emphasized, which may explain the omission by these later Orphics of some of the unsavory mythological elements in their earlier myths. The 41st Orphic hymn is also to Demeter, this time in her form as Mother Antaea, Queen Antaea, goddess and the many-named mother of immortal gods and of mortal men. Weary from searching, weary from wandering wide and far, you once ended your fast in the valley of Eleusis. You came to Hades for noble Persephone. Your guide was the innocent child of Deusalus, and you brought the news of pure chthonic Zeus's holy union. You bore divine Eubolus by yielding to human need. O goddess, O queen to whom many pray, I beseech you to come graciously to your pious initiates. According to Athanasicus, Mother Antaea is here another name for Demeter. The mythological complex surrounding the abduction of Persephone, absent in the previous hymn, is the focus of this one. The name Antaea itself means opposite, hostile, or besought with prayers. Mother of gods and of mortal men also refers to Rhea and Cybele. Here, the messenger and guide to Hades is the innocent child of Deusalus, who is the one who informs Demeter of the truth about the abduction, not Hecate and Helios as in the Homeric hymn. It is from this Orphic hymn in particular that we find that other version of the Eleusinian Demeter myth, according to which the goddess herself, named mother of even the gods, perhaps a Gaia-Rhea-Demeter hybrid, in the context of her searching, herself descends to Hades. Next, Demeter is said to bear Euboleus, often the brother of Triptolemos, but it doesn't tell us with whom, perhaps Iason, or perhaps even Keleos, as in Calasso's retelling. The Orphic hymn is clear that it is not Hades as a separate god who abducts and marries Persephone, but pure chthonic Zeus. Like in Calasso's interpretation, Demeter here yields to human need, or in his words, prostitutes herself, in order to be able to complete her descent and retrieval of Persephone, and so to born divine Eubolus, god of good counsel, another form of Dionysus, Phanes, or Erechthaios. The evidence of the Bacchic gold leaves is relevant here, since there we find earlier Orphic initiates claiming to have been initiated into the rites of Bacchus, Demeter Chthoniia, and the Mountain Mother. There, as here, Euboleus appears especially in regards to the claim that the initiates will become as gods. Let's look now to the 29th Orphic hymn to Persephone, and also to Persephone's children in the Orphic hymns, who are Dionysus, as well as Melinoe. The hymn sings, Persephone, blessed daughter of great Zeus, sole offspring of Demeter, come and accept this gracious sacrifice. Much honored spouse of Pluton, discreet and life-giving, you command the gates of Hades and the bowels of the earth, lovely tressed Praxidike, pure bloom of Dio, mother of the Erinyes, queen of the netherworld, secretly sired by Zeus in clandestine union, mother of loud-roaring many-shaped Euboleus, radiant and luminous and a splendid old age to him who is sailing in your realm, O Queen, and to mighty Pluton's kingdom. Playmate of the seasons, revered, almighty, maiden rich in fruits, brilliant and horned, only beloved of mortals, in spring you take your joy in the meadow of breezes, you show your holy figure in branches teeming with grass-green fruits. In autumn you were made a kidnapper's bride, you alone are life and death to toiling mortals. O Persephone, you nourish all always and kill them too. Hearken, O blessed goddess, send forth the fruits of the earth that you blossom in peace, and in gentle-handed health bring a blessed life. This hymn may seem to be contradicting the hymn to Antaea, in which Demeter is said to have given birth to Euboleus, but we must recall that Persephone and Demeter as Dio are closely syncretized in Orphism. This hymn does not conceal the clandestine union of Zeus and Persephone, and names her mother of the Erinyes, also Dionysus and Melinoe, as we'll learn in a moment. Just as Zeus had mated with Demeter in chthonic or serpent form to produce Persephone, so the story repeats itself in the case of Persephone. She too is pursued by Zeus, who again takes the form of a snake, as we hear in Clement of Alexandria. As Calasso puts this most disturbing scene in all of Orphic thought, Persephone was born in the 10th month. Zeus watched her grow. When she was strong and flourishing and swollen with lymph, he felt an overwhelming desire to do the same thing all over again. This time he transforms himself into a snake, wraps his daughter in immense coils, and grips her in a ferocious lock, much as he had done to Demeter and also to Semele, plays with her tenderly, and whispers his adoration through their coitus. Some myths tell that the coupling of Zeus and Demeter occurred in the form of bulls, just as the coupling with Poseidon occurred in the form of horses. Impregnated with the seed of a bull, Demeter had given birth to a girl. Filled with the seed of Zeus, a snake, Persephone gives birth to a bull, Dionysus. Persephone frequently appears in the Orphic or Bacchic gold tablets, and the initiates either greet her or appeal to her frequently for rewards in the afterlife, and even perhaps allude to the initiate's guilt inherited from his Titan forebears who killed Dionysus. In one tablet, the initiate is assured to reach the holy meadows and groves of Persephone, and in the magical papyri, Persephone is syncretized with Selene, Hecate, Artemis, and also called, like in this hymn, Praxidike, dispenser of justice, and mother of the Erinyes. Here, Persephone's monstrous qualities are emphasized, brilliant and horned, and her fertility associations with seasons, fruit, spring, meadows, breezes, and branches. Persephone, like Demeter and Hecate, is double-natured, bringing life or death, nourishing or killing. We'll be looking much further into the Orphic Persephone next week. Persephone's children with Zeus are again the Erinyes, Dionysus, and also Melinoe. Melinoe is worth a look here, although she's an obscure figure. This hymn being the sole literary testimony of her existence, the only other appearance of her name being found inscribed on a magical device, presumably used for divination. Here she is the vexing daughter of Persephone and a saffron-cloaked and amber-colored nymph who might drive to madness, and she shares all these attributes with Hecate. Athanasicus defines Melinoe as an infernal psychic force, a spectral embodiment of Persephone's anger that irrationally lashes out at mortals, and hence the need in this hymn to appease her. She seems to be related to the dyad of the Erinyes, or Furies, and Eumenides, or kindly ones, a spooky and exacting goddess who is therefore called upon to reveal her kindly face. Her name seems to mean gentle-minded, and so it's interesting that she's the goddess who brings anxiety, insomnia, sleep paralysis, and nocturnal phantasmagoria of all kinds. And hence she is called upon to banish the soul's frenzy to the ends of the earth and to remain kindly and holy. As the hymn sings, I call upon Melinoe, saffron-cloaked nymph of the earth, whom revered Persephone bore by the mouth of the river Cocytus, upon the sacred bed of Cronian Zeus. In the guise of Pluton, Zeus tricked Persephone, and through wily plots bedded her. A two-bodied spectre sprang forth from Persephone's fury. This spectre drives mortals to madness with her airy apparitions, as she appears in weird shapes and strange forms, now plain to the eye, now shadowy, now shining in the darkness. All this in the unnerving attacks in the gloom of night. O goddess, O queen of those below, I beseech you, to banish the soul's frenzy to the ends of the earth, and to show to the initiates a kindly and holy face. Note how here, unlike in the hymn to Eleusinian Demeter, Cronian Zeus and Hades or Pluto are distinguished. The upshot of the depiction of Eleusinian Demeter and the myths of the Eleusinian mysteries in the Orphic hymns is again well summarized by Calasso when he writes that Cora and Demeter are a dual being, even sharing the same name, Dio. In a dazzling transposition, every gesture made by one corresponds to a gesture of the other. When their stories approach a stasis that would prove fatal, Cora sitting on the throne in funereal immobility, and Demeter sitting on the stone that does not laugh at Eleusis. Something happens to dispel the rigidity. Cora, distracted by what Hades is saying, eats a pomegranate seed, and Demeter, distracted by Baobo's obscene dance, drinks the initiate's broth, the Kukaion, like a hungry traveler. It was from these two gestures that the mysteries arose. By accepting and assimilating food that were neither nectar nor ambrosia, Demeter and Cora come to share in the guilt peculiar to men and expose themselves to that special weakness that the gods had always mocked, that submission to time that causes living beings to disappear, and at the same time the complicity of those beings with their own destroyer, since man cannot live without himself making something else disappear. The mysteries are the wound that open in the hitherto intact Olympian epidermis, a wound which then tries in vain to heal itself in ceremony after ceremony. That the wound may never heal is the hope of the initiates. These profound words from Colosso are in fact the best possible introduction to the significance of Eleusis and the Eleusinian mysteries in the philosophy and also in the poetry of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Inspired in his interest in Eleusis by his, at the time, dear friend Hölderlin, Hegel will eventually write the Eleusinian mysteries into the opening chapters of his masterwork, The Phenomenology of Spirit. And there, what the mysteries will signify is exactly what Colosso here says: the descent of absolute spirit, or the gods, Demeter and Persephone, into the way of life of finite mortals, a submission to time that causes living beings to disappear, and at the same time a complicity with the source of destruction. Since man, and now as well Demeter and Persephone, cannot live without consuming something else and thus making it disappear. In his history of subjective spirit becoming absolute spirit, Hegel would very much agree with Colosso. The hope of the philosopher and of the Eleusinian initiate is not to heal the wound of the fracturing of the divine and the mortal world, but rather to hope that the wound may never heal, and so that gods would continue to appear on this earth to their initiates. This profound view of the world is expressed by Hegel 10 years before the appearance of his Phenomenology of Spirit in his Eleusis poem dedicated to his friend Hölderlin. A full interpretation of this poem would take a whole lecture, but we can at least read it here, let it wash over us, and then turn to just a few elements of its interpretation in the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben. It reads, "Oh, if the doors of your sanctuary should crumble by themselves, O Ceres, who reigned in Eleusis, drunk with enthusiasm, I would shiver with your nearness. I would understand your revelations. I would interpret the lofty meaning of the images. I would hear the hymns at the gods' banquets, the lofty maxims of their council. Even your hallways have ceased to echo, goddess. The circle of the gods has fled back to Olympus from the consecrated altars, fled from the tomb of a profaned humanity, the innocent genius who enchanted them here. The wisdom of your priests is silent, and not one note of the sacred initiations preserved for us. And in vain strive the scholars, their curiosity greater than their love of wisdom. The seekers possess this love, and they disdain you. To master it, they dig for words in which your lofty meaning might be engraved in vain. Only dust and ashes do they seize, where your life returns no more for them. And yet, even rotting and lifeless, they congratulate themselves, the eternally dead, be satisfied in vain. No sign remains of your celebration, no trace of an image. For the son of the initiation, the lofty doctrine was too full. The profundity of the ineffable sentiment was too sacred for him to value a desiccated sign. Now thought does not rise up from spirit sunken beyond time and space to purify infinity. It forgets itself, and now once again its consciousness is aroused. He who should want to speak about it with others would have to speak the language of angels, would have to experience the poverty of words. He is horrified of having thought so little of the sacred, for having made so little of it, that speech seems to him a sin, and though still alive, he closes his mouth. That which the initiate prohibits sage law also prohibits the poorest souls to make known what he had seen, heard, and felt during the sacred night, so that even the best part of his prayers was not disturbed by the clamor of their disorder, and the empty chattering did not dispose him towards the sacred, and this was not dragged in the mud, but was entrusted to memory, so that it did not become a plaything or a ware of some sophist who would have sold it like an obolus, or the mantle of an eloquent hypocrite, or even the rod of a joyful youth, or become so empty at the end that only the echo of foreign tongues would find its roots. Your sons, O goddess, miserly with your honor, did not carry it through the streets and markets, but they cultivated it in the breast's inner chambers. And so you did not live on their lips. Their life honored you, and you live still in their acts. Even tonight, sacred divinity, I heard you. Often the life of your children reveals you, and I introduce you as the soul of their acts. You are the lofty meaning, the true faith which, divine, when all else crumbles, does not falter. To conclude this lecture on Demeter, Persephone, and the Eleusinian Mysteries, I've also assigned this week in the modules a short recent essay by Agamben, the Unspeakable Girl, about Eleusis. Before summarizing this wonderful short piece, which ends with Hegel's Eleusis poem, it's worth noting that for Giorgio Agamben, the return to Demeter and Persephone is very much a full circle from the beginning of his philosophical thought in one of his first books and seminars, Language and Death, The Place of Negativity. It's probably fair to say that Giorgio Agamben is today the world's greatest living continental philosopher, and his work and innumerable books have had enormous impact on more or less every field of academic philosophical inquiry. Beginning his journey as a student of Heidegger's in his 1968 Lethor seminar, one of Agamben's earliest original contributions is to turn to Hegel's Eleusis poem, to wit, as key to unlocking the meaning of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, and also as a key document which can help us understand Heidegger's later philosophy and one of its most enigmatic statements, quote, "Mortals are they who can experience death as death. Animals cannot do so, but animals cannot speak either. The essential relation between death and language flashes up before us, but remains still unthought. Is it possible that a deeper exposition of Heidegger's statement here would involve the mysterious relationship between gods and mortals in the myths of Demeter, Persephone, and Eleusis? That seems to be very much the young Agamben's surmise when he turns to Hegel's Eleusis poem and writes, quote, "The fact that the philosopher of the dialectic and logos portrays himself here as a guardian of Eleusinian silence and of the ineffable is a circumstance that is often quickly dismissed. This early poetic exercise was evidently composed under the influence of Hölderlin, poet of the very Begeisterung or spiritualization that Hegel had to so emphatically renounce 10 years later. For the then 26-year-old philosopher, who though young had already read the texts that would most decisively come to influence him, and who was so enraged in a frequent philosophical correspondence with Schelling, this poem represents an isolated episode. Hegel literally writes no other poems. It is generally supposed that no positive traces of the poem remained in the successive development of his thought. Here it is interesting to observe that the Eleusinian Mysteries in fact appears unexpectedly at another point in Hegel's writing, specifically at the first chapter of the Phenomenology of Spirit, which is titled Sense Certainty, or the This and Meaning. However, the significance of this mystery in the phenomenology appears to be the opposite of that expressed in the poem Eleusis, at least at first glance. Hegel writes in the Sense Certainty chapter, quote, "In this respect we can tell those who assert the truth and certainty of the reality of sense objects that they should go back to the most elementary school of wisdom, that is, the ancient Eleusinian mysteries of Ceres and Bacchus, and that they still have to learn the mystery of eating bread and drinking wine. For he who is initiated into these mysteries not only comes to doubt the being of sensuous things, but to despair of it. In part, he himself accomplishes their negativity, and in part, he sees them accomplish it themselves. Even the animals are not shut out from this wisdom, but on the contrary, show themselves to be the most profoundly initiated into it. For they do not just stand idly in front of sensuous things as if these possessed intrinsic being, but despairing of their reality and completely assured of their negativity, they grasp them without hesitation and consume them. And all nature, like the animals, celebrates these open mysteries which teach the truth about sensuous things." End quote. Again, a full exposition of even this paragraph of Hegel would take its own lecture, but Agamben makes a brief comment which is illuminating. The content of the Eleusinian Mysteries is for Hegel nothing other than this: experiencing the negativity that is always already inherent in any Meinung, that is, meaning as it appears to me, of sense certainty. The initiate learns here to not say what he means, but in these terms he has no need to remain silent, as in the poem Eleusis, or to experience the poverty of words. Just as the animal preserves the truth of sensuous things simply by devouring them, that is, by recognizing them as nothing, so language guards the unspeakable by speaking it, that is, by grasping it in its negativity. The sacred law of the goddess of Eleusis, who, in Hegel's youthful hymn, prohibited the initiate from revealing in words what he had seen, heard, or felt during the night, is now subsumed by language itself. The Eleusinian mystery of the phenomenology is thus the same mystery as the poem Eleusis, but now language has captured in itself the power of silence, and that which appeared earlier as unspeakable profundity can be guarded in its negative capacity in the very heart of the word. Hegel, in other words, here claims to transcend poetic mystery in the name of the philosophical concept. Wizened and at the peak of his career, Agamben returns to the Eleusinian mysteries, this time guided not by Hegel but by Persephone, the unspeakable girl, in 2014, and produces a book centered around a small essay which further underlines Agamben's debt to the readings of classical mythology to be found in Karl Karenyi. Agamben starts out, at the heart of Karenyi's and Jung's studies, their famous collaboration on the Eleusinian mysteries is the figure of the Urkind, the originary child, seen not only in its male and female aspects, but above all in its androgyny, the quote, original and originary, undifferentiated, the originary child. Jung writes that the child is hermaphroditic. Hermaphroditism has progressively become a redemptive force that supervenes conflict. The Cora, or divine girl, is similar, but annuls the distinction between the two essential figures of femininity, woman or mother, and girl or virgin. Persephone is both woman and girl, mother and virgin, perpetually, and thus unspeakable. And it is for this reason that Eleusinian Demeter scandalized the church father Clement of Alexandria, who asked, "Am I to call her mother or wife?" The Cora, or other side of Dio, is a yet more disturbing figure with no precise chronological age, the word Cora itself meaning vital force. A Cora can be old like the Phorkydes, the long-lived girls, or the Graiai with white hair, or the Furies. All that survives of Eleusinian initiation into the mystery of the Cora consists of profound banalities. The revelation of the cut grain, hai kai, along with the words rain, render fertile, which have the character of something unspeakable in pagan religion. From here, the deepest question of Agamben's essay becomes the relationship between the mysteries and philosophy. And here Agamben begins from a remark of Erwin Rohde, which focuses less on the amazing silence of the initiates in our sources, their near unanimous ability to keep the secret, and more on the fact, in Rohde's words, that it was impossible to reveal the mystery because there was nothing to reveal. The term for divulging the mystery is literally to dance it out, to dance it away, here glossed as to fake it or to imitate it poorly. Already, as we've seen in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, it is not possible to seek to know through the mysteries, but rather, as Aristotle states in his Lost Dialogue on Philosophy, the theoria, contemplative vision, or mystical seeing of the initiates, was less related to knowing or learning, and more to a feeling and experiencing. In Aristotle's words, a pathine, or being put into a visionary state of direct access, or touching the pure phenomenal revelations of the Cora's disclosure. Teaching and learning, that is philosophy in the Platonic or Aristotelian mode, is not initiation, totelestikon. It does not come through instruction and listening like philosophy, but only when the mind itself is illuminated, elampsis, a word referring to Demeter's torch, and its capacity to illuminate the darkness and even to set in the mind a gentle fire. Another term Aristotle is said to have employed, this time quoted in the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, is eis phantasian, imagination or visionary fantasy, the very phantasmagoria that leads to elampsis, flaring up, and autopsia, or self-seeing. Most wondrously, the word thamastikon, not only in Aristotle, but especially in Plato, is a word frequently used to compare the phenomenology of mystery initiation with the progress of instruction in philosophy. Learning philosophy and being initiated into the mysteries are, on the terms of this argument from Plato and Aristotle, more or less the same thing, but with a few key differences. In fact, reviving this tradition in his 1802 Bruno, or On the Divine and Natural Principle of Things, Friedrich Schelling will announce that, quote, "Since philosophy's lofty position is based on its cognition of the eternal and the unchangeable, it is evident that the mysteries' teachings are philosophy, the most sublime, sacred, and excellent philosophy passed down to us from remote antiquity. Thus the mysteries are actually related to mythology in the very same way that philosophy is related to poetry. There was good reason then behind our decision that mythology ought to be left to the poets, while philosophers should establish and conduct the mysteries." As contemporary classical studies scholar Alberto Bernabé puts the Eleusinian experience in his article on Aristotle and the mysteries, quote, "Initiation into the mysteries is an experience, indeed. It is a forceful event operating through vivid contrasts that are sharply produced, life and death, light and darkness, terror and happiness. Such contrasts subdue the spirit through a powerful and non-rational shock to its own identity, thus making each individual communicate with a superior reality. Anyone who participates in the teletai at Eleusis feels himself to be placed in nature, in the history of the cosmos, as if he had finally managed to understand without words man's place in this world, the meaning of life, and his future destiny in the hereafter. It is in sum an instrument that releases the initiate from uncertainties and anxieties, useful in accepting his or her place in this world and the next. The older and wizened Agamben still finds in the Eleusinian mysteries the precondition or condition of possibility, the irreducible experience that is necessary in order to do philosophy. Still resisting philosophical initiation of a merely speculative and conceptual kind as in Hegel, the later Agamben wants us to approach the Eleusinian experience from out of its phenomenological provenance. And he makes quick work of scholars who would dismiss this side of Aristotle's teachings. The knowledge conveyed at Eleusis could thus be expressed in names, but not in propositions. The unspeakable girl, the Cora, could be named, but not said. In the mystery cult, there is no place for logos apophantikos, assertion, but only for the onoma, the name. And in the name or naming, something like a touching and a seeing occurs. Ludwig Wittgenstein would no doubt, having read this, either groan or growl, for Agamben fully accepts the phenomenological wisdom of naming and of Eleusinian initiation as the precondition for doing philosophy aright. In contrast to this, Wittgenstein will warn against naming as a queer connection between a word and an object, and quote from Wittgenstein, "You really get such a queer connection when the philosopher tries to bring out the relationship between name and thing by staring at an object in front of him and repeating a name or even the word this innumerable times." Clearly a swipe there against Hegel. Wittgenstein goes on, "For philosophical problems arise when language goes on holiday, and here we may indeed fancy naming to be some kind of remarkable act of mind, as it were the baptism of an object." Wittgenstein doesn't exactly object to poetic naming as a valid way of relating to phenomenological or initiatory religious experience, but he does suggest that any philosophy based in a naming phenomenology of sacred experience is equivalent to language going on holiday. In fact, this is pretty much what Agamben says, as well as Plato and Aristotle. The initiates at Eleusis do not learn and acquire knowledge, but they are put into a state through which the liturgy of the mystery becomes transparent. The difference here is that for Agamben, Plato, and Aristotle, this experience is necessary for philosophy. What Aristotle is really saying is just what Plato had said in the Phaedrus and the Symposium. Without the mysteries and initiatory vision, there would be neither philosophical discourse nor science. That a girl at play became the ideal figure for the supreme initiation and completion of philosophy, the figure for something that is at once thought an initiation and thus unspeakable. This is the mystery. Agamben goes on to examine the comic as opposed to tragic elements in Eleusinian initiation and the deep historical traces of Eleusis in the Christian liturgy as mystery celebration. In fact, our words celebration and ceremony are traceable to Demeter, or the Roman version of her name, Ceres, and thus to Demeter's quite Dionysian festivals. Agamben notes with Otto Cassel how, unlike in the theological tradition in which the Eucharist is guaranteed effective by theological definition, the wafer and the wine really are the flesh and the blood of Christ, regardless of the intentions or moral purity of the priest. In contrast to this shoring up of effectivity in Christian liturgy, the transmission of pagan initiation through mystery cult is always precarious, a quote, hesitant movement through darkness and half-light on a path suspended between the infernal and supernal gods, a description Agamben is drawing from the Neoplatonic writer Apuleius' The Golden Ass. The contrast between pagan and Christian mystery for Agamben comes down to this, quote, if the Christian mystery is, in this sense, always effective, precariousness is the adventurous and nocturnal dimension in which the pagan initiate moves. Here Agamben follows the scholar Garcia in underlining the essential connection between the novel form and the meaning of the mystery. The hopes and striving of initiatory practice correspond exactly to the adventures and misadventures of the protagonist in the ancient novel. And Agamben goes on to speak here of Edgar Wynne's marvelous book on pagan mysteries in Renaissance painting, as well as the work of the Warburg school, such as the Mnemosyne Atlas, being not without their elements of Eleusinian initiation. And in this way, the Eleusinian mythomysteries are still very present throughout modernity. As Carreño wrote, in Botticelli's painting there is as much live mythology as in a Homeric hymn. And Edgar Wynne has shown how through Plotinus and Proclus, the pagan mystical tradition exercised a decisive influence on the leaders of German idealism, especially in the way that Hegel and Schelling conceived of thought after the model of the unity of opposites, or the coincidentia oppositorum. Agamben's point here is simply to underline that the images of Eleusis are still very much the image of thought. And so let's conclude with Agamben's retrospective on Hegel's Eleusis poem. 35 years after his seminar on language and death, Agamben concludes his essay The Unspeakable Girl with a retrospective on Hegel's poem. Hegel's Demeter still reflects the profundity of the unspeakable element, but that which the initiate forbids himself to say is precisely what becomes the task of subsequent Western philosophy, literature, and art. What was seen, heard, and felt in the sacred night in Hegel's poem still survives in the echo of foreign tongues, as in Hölderlin's hymn Mnemosyne. Hegel's invocation of Eleusis in the Phenomenology are now seen by Agamben more accurately as a, quote, more disenchanted and nearly ironic vision, in which even animals are privy to Eleusinian wisdom. The immaculate brevity of Agamben's piece might be understood as the first sign of the great silence that is enveloping him. For reflecting on these points he would have liked to more carefully develop in his Language and Death seminar, he turns in closing to another Italian scholar, Giorgio Colli, who has indeed shown past Hegel that Eleusinian initiation does close the gap between animal and human spheres, and that Demeter and Cora are as well potnia therons, or mistresses of the animals. All this points back to Agamben's book on the open, man and animal, as well as to another Italian, Colasso's original world of theriomorphic metamorphosis. Zeus, Poseidon, Dionysus all becoming bulls, horses, serpents, or minotaurs. Bottom line, if we want to understand Demeter, Persephone, and the Eleusinian mysteries, in fact, Italian writers, scholars, and philosophers are well ahead of the global pack, and Agamben can find no other way to conclude his essay than by noting, as he did in Homo Sacer, that the Greek word for animal, zoon, means literally living being. And the gods, too, are living beings. They have zoe, which is to say that it is in living nature that man and God commune. And here Agamben applies to great effect the contested testimony that during festivals at Eleusis, no animals were sacrificed. Either way, the Cora, or unspeakable girl, is the threshold between woman and child, virgin and mother, and also animal and human. In the mystery cults, the Greeks experienced extremes of the human condition, the divine and the animal, and without the mystery cults, these extremes would have been for them unthinkable. The living being lost in the animal rediscovered himself in the divine, as he who was lost in the divine rediscovered himself in the animal. Rhoda, Fraser, and Carl Karenyi all present this tenacious interpretation that what we witness in Demeter, Persephone, and Eleusinian mysteries is above all the Chora as the abyss of seed, the symbol of that which transcends the individual in its unending cycles of life arising from death. For Agamben, this seemingly profound interpretation also has the defect of presuming a concealed content of which the myth would be a cipher. But in fact, the true heart of Eleusinian wisdom is perfectly expressed without such a cipher already in Aristotle in another fragment of his lost work on philosophy. Quote, "Life, because it is an initiation, muesis, and the most perfect mystical rite, should be full of serenity and joy. In the initiations, we sit in religious silence and in harmonious order. It occurs to no one to complain during the initiation or to groan when watching the Pythian games or when drinking to Kronos. In fact, we contaminate these celebrations that the gods stage and in which we are initiated whenever we live amongst bitter lament, preoccupation, and breathless anxiety." Echoing Aristotle, Agamben concludes this piece, "We are to live life like an initiation, but to what? Not to a doctrine, but to life itself and its absolute absence of mystery. There is no mystery. There is an unspeakable girl. We differ from the other animals in that we are initiated into our lives, which is to say we must first lose ourselves in the human so as to rediscover ourselves as alive, and vice versa." Colasso, for his part, echoes a similar conclusion on the Eleusinian mysteries, quoting Strabo, "Men imitate the gods chiefly when they are doing good, or rather when they are happy. The gods, in contrast, imitate men when they do or suffer evil, or rather when they are unhappy. We have evidence of such unhappiness on the part of the gods in what we hear tell of the gods in the myths and the hymns of their abductions, secret wanderings, exile, and servitude. It was precisely these elements, these precious clues, indeed the only clues to the experience of gods on earth, that men composed the mysteries. Here every gesture achieves its maximum density and enjoins us to silence. And in the mysteries, men repeat the gestures the gods made, as they imitated men in order to free themselves from divine guilt. Hence the vertigo of the mysteries. More even than in their happiness, men approach the gods by celebrating the gestures the gods made when they were unhappy. It was only for those not initiated in the mysteries that they seemed to have something to do with the immortality of men. For the initiates, however, the mysteries were the moment when the gods became entangled underneath. Many things related to death and mourning are to be found mixed together in the initiation ceremonies, says Plutarch. And that most precise turncoat of the pagan world, Clement of Alexandria, is even more precise, indeed brutal. The mysteries can be summed up in two words, he says: killings and burials. Colasso concludes on the Eleusinian mysteries, "It is not the men who pass through the mysteries who are immortal, but the mysteries themselves." When in Smyrna, the public speaker Aristides hears that a raid has devastated Eleusis, he says, "The battles on sea and the battles on land and the laws and the constitutions and the arrogance and the tongues and all the rest have melted away. Only the mysteries remain." Thanks for listening, everyone, and this has been your lecture on Demeter, Persephone, and the Eleusinian mysteries. See you next week when we turn to the realm of Hades.